She had $3.70 in her purse, a dead man's letter in her hand, and 40 miles of Montana blizzard between her and the only shelter on this mountain. The cold had stopped hurting. That was the strangest thing. The snow against her cheek felt almost warm now. She closed her eyes and she let herself fall. That was when the ground began to shake. Three shapes came toward her through the swirling white, tall as trees, broad as barn doors, walking through the storm as if the storm were nothing. She did not yet know their names. She did not yet know that one of them had not walked off this mountain in 4.5 years. She did not yet know that the letter in her hand had lied to her and that the lie was about to save her life. Friend, pull your chair close to the fire. The wind is rising on the Bitterroot Range, and this story is just beginning. The wind was not just cold, it was a warning, a low howling thing that came down off the high peaks of the Bitterroot Range like a living creature, hungry and patient. It moved through the lodgepole pines first, bending them sideways, stripping the last brittle needles from their lower branches. Then it crossed the open ground, picking up the loose powder snow and turning the air into a wall of white. By the time it reached the lone figure stumbling through the drifts, the wind had teeth. Adelaide Pemberton could no longer feel her feet. She knew this in some distant part of her mind the way a person knows a fact about someone else. Her boots, sturdy enough for a Boston winter, had been useless against the snow that came past her knees within the first 10 minutes off the road. Her navy blue traveling dress, the finest thing she had ever owned, hung on her now like a sheet of frozen iron. The hem dragged. The wool had soaked through hours ago, then frozen, and now it cracked with every step she took. She had a letter in her hand. She did not remember anymore why she was holding it. The fingers of her right hand had curled around the paper, and the paper had become part of her, stiff and pale and useless. Through the icicles forming on her dark lashes, she could just make out a few of the words on the page. The handwriting had been gentle, sloping, formed with care. The words had promised her a home. The words had promised her a husband. The words had promised her the end of being alone. The words she now understood had lied. The narrator's voice came down soft and slow, the way an old grandfather speaks to a grandchild he loves. The letter had promised her a husband. The letter had promised her a home. The letter had lied. And now, in the middle of this Montana storm, that lie was going to kill her. Her knees buckled. She did not fall so much as fold like a piece of paper, losing its shape. The snow caught her, and for a moment it felt warm. That was the strangest thing. The cold had stopped hurting. There was a distant sweetness to the way the snow pressed up against her cheek, the way it cradled her shoulders. She thought of her mother. She thought of a kitchen in Boston with copper pots hanging from a hook. She thought of the smell of bread on a Sunday morning and the sound of her father's voice reading from the Book of Psalms. She thought of all the places she had ever felt safe, and all of them were a long way away now, and none of them were coming back. She closed her eyes. That was when the ground began to shake. It was a deep tremor at first, the kind a child feels when a wagon team passes too close to a house. Then it grew. The snow next to her cheek vibrated. The air shifted. She forced one eye open and saw through the swirling white a shape moving toward her, then another, then a third. Three shapes, tall as trees, broad as barn doors, walking through the storm as if the storm were nothing. The first one reached her. He did not speak. He bent down and put his huge gloved hand against her throat, feeling for a pulse, and his hand was so warm, even through the leather, that she nearly cried out. She heard his voice, then low and rough and close to her ear. "She is alive," the voice said. "Barely." Another voice, younger, lighter. "Get her up then. We do not have long." The first one slid one arm under her knees and another behind her shoulders, and he lifted her as if she weighed nothing. She could feel the strength of him through her frozen dress, through the heavy buffalo robe he wore. His chest was a wall. His heartbeat was a slow, steady drum. She let her head fall against his shoulder because she could not hold it up any longer, and the last thing she heard before the dark closed in was the third voice, the deepest of the three, saying only one word: home, then nothing. Before we go any further into this story, friend, if you are new to the channel, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. New Frontier Tales every week, told the old way, slow and proper, the way they ought to be told. And while you are at it, leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from tonight. I love hearing from every one of you. Now then, let us go back 4 days. Let us go back to the moment Adelaide Pemberton stepped off that train and learned that the world she had crossed a continent to reach did not exist anymore. 4 days earlier, the platform at Bitter Creek Station, the iron wheels screeched against the rails and the great black engine hissed steam into a sky the color of wet slate. The little wooden platform was nearly empty. Two men loaded a crate of nails onto a buckboard. A boy ran along the board selling apples wrapped in brown paper. The wind off the Bitterroot Range came down sharp, but it was nothing, yet nothing compared to what was coming. Adelaide stepped down from the passenger car, holding a small carpet bag in one hand and the letter in the other. She had read that letter so many times during the journey from Boston that the paper had grown soft along the folds. She knew every word by heart. She knew the writer's name, Theodore Ashford. Teddy. He had asked her to call him Teddy in his fourth letter, the one where he had written about the wildflowers that came to the high meadows in June. In return, she had told him that her father had always called her Della since she was small. He had told her that he was a man of modest means but honest work. He had told her that he had a small place at the foot of the mountain. He had told her that he was lonely and that her photograph had given him hope, and that if she would do him the honor of becoming his wife, he would spend every day of his life trying to be worthy of her. She had kept that photograph of herself wrapped in a handkerchief in her carpet bag. It was the only photograph that had ever been taken of her. She had $3.70 in her purse. That was every coin she had in the world. She looked across the platform, smiling, expecting a tall man in a clean shirt to step forward and remove his hat. Instead, an old man in a station master's coat came toward her, his face lined like dried oak bark, his eyes wet at the corners. He held an envelope in his gloved hand, and he held it the way a man holds a thing he wishes he could throw away. You must be the Pemberton girl, he said. Yes, sir. I am here to meet Mr. Ashford, Mr. Theodore Ashford. The old man stopped walking. He looked at his boots. He held the envelope out to her. I am sorry, miss. I am awful sorry. The fever took him 3 weeks back. We tried to wire you in Boston, but the telegram never caught your train. He passed quiet, miss, in his sleep. He was a good man. The town will miss him. The world tilted. Adelaide did not open the envelope. She did not need to. She felt the floor of the platform shift beneath her boots, felt the sky lower itself a few inches, felt the cold air rush into her lungs and refused to leave. She gripped her carpet bag harder. She kept her chin up because her father had taught her that a Pemberton kept her chin up no matter what came, and she had no one left in this world but the lessons her father had given her. The old station master was still talking. The next train east does not run until the spring thaw mists. The pass is closing. Storm coming down off the divide. Best find shelter before nightfall. The hotel is yonder, but they take payment up front. She nodded. She did not trust her voice. He touched the brim of his cap and turned back toward the station house. The door swung shut behind him with a small, dry click, and Adelaide Pemberton stood alone on a wooden platform 1,000 miles from the only home she had ever known, with $3.70 in her purse and a dead man's letter in her hand. That was when the carriage came. It was a fine black carriage. The lacquer polished the brass fittings, catching what little light was left in the day. It rolled up to the platform with a soft creak of springs drawn by two matched bay geldings whose breath plumed in the cold. The driver hopped down and opened the door. A man stepped out who did not belong on that platform at all. He was perhaps 50 years of age, trim, well-fed. His coat was beaver pelt, expensive and warm, and his gloves were yellow leather. He carried a silver-headed walking stick that he did not seem to need. His face had been handsome once, but something in it had soured over the years, the way milk sours when it sits too long in the sun. His eyes were the color of pond water in March. Mr. Mortimer Holloway of the Bitter Creek Bank, at your service. He swept off his hat and gave her a small bow. His voice was smooth, cultivated. He had been to schools in the East. He had practiced this voice in front of a mirror. You are the Pemberton girl, are you not? Theodore's intended. May I offer my deepest condolences. He was a friend of the bank. Indeed, he was a particular friend of mine. She did not like him. She could not have said why. The instinct was older than thought. She felt it in her stomach, in the back of her neck, the way a deer feels the presence of a wolf without yet seeing it. I thank you for your kindness, Mr. Holloway, please. Mortimer, may I drive you into town? The hotel is no place for a lady alone. I have a fine spare room at my house. My housekeeper, Mrs. Beale, will see you settled. We can discuss certain matters in the morning when you are rested. Matters, sir. He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. Theodore left certain debts. $300 to my bank, in fact. As his betrothed, you may have inherited certain obligations. Or perhaps we can come to an arrangement, a mutually beneficial one. There are options, Miss Pemberton. There are always options for a young woman of your evident quality. The way he said quality made her skin crawl. She kept her chin up. She thought of her father reading from the Book of Psalms. She thought of her mother's cameo brooch, the one she wore now at her collar, the only thing she had left of either of them. You are most generous, sir, but I should pay my respects at the chapel first. I saw it as we came in. At the edge of town, I will join you in due course. Holloway's smile thinned. The chapel is closed, my dear. The Reverend Hawkins moved on last summer. Then I shall pay my respects at the door, sir. It is the proper thing. My father was a man of God. She did not wait for his answer. She turned and began to walk, carpetbag in hand, letter still clutched to her chest. She walked off the platform and onto the frozen road and toward the dark line of pines at the edge of the settlement. She did not look back. She heard behind her the soft click of his walking stick against the boards. She heard him say her name once. She did not stop. She did not turn. She did not know yet that she was walking straight into the storm of the century. She only knew that she would rather walk into a wilderness than ride in that man's carriage. The first snowflake fell against her cheek before she reached the trees. The second fell a moment later. By the time she was a half-mile out of town, the sky had let go of everything it had been holding all day, and the world began to disappear around her, one pine at a time. Now we return to her, half buried in the drift, lifted in the arms of a man whose face she has not yet seen. We return to the cabin where her story truly begins. She woke slowly, the way a swimmer comes up from deep water. The first thing she knew was warmth, a heavy layered warmth that smelled of pine pitch and wood smoke and tanned leather and something else, something she could not name yet, something like dried sage and gun oil and a man's clean sweat. She was buried under a mountain of furs, bare by the weight of it, wolf around her shoulders, a buffalo robe at her feet. The second thing she knew was the light, orange, low dancing, a fire, a real fire, not a small lamp. A great stone hearth of a fire throwing heat across a wide room. The third thing she knew was the silence. It was not empty silence. It was a silence with men in it. She could feel them before she opened her eyes. 3 of them. 3 different kinds of stillness, 3 different rhythms of breath, one by the fire, one near the door, one at the long pine table to her right, none of them moving, all of them watching her. She opened her eyes. The cabin was larger than she would have guessed from the outside. The ceiling was high-crossed by black beams of squared lodgepole. The walls were hewn timber chinked with clay and horsehair dark with the smoke of 2 decades. Above the hearth ran a long mantelpiece of cedar polished by years of use, and on it sat a small wooden horse, dark with age, the legs caught in mid-gallop. Below the mantel, the great stone fireplace rose to the rafters. A cast-iron Dutch oven hung on a chain over the coals. She turned her head a little slowly and saw the 3 men. The one by the fire was the largest. He sat in a heavy oak chair with his back to her, and even sitting, he filled the chair completely. His shoulders were the broadest she had ever seen on a living man. His hair was dark chestnut brown, long enough to brush his collar tied back with a leather thong. His beard was thick. His hands resting on the arms of the chair were enormous, scarred, the knuckles split and healed again over many winters. He did not turn when she stirred, but she knew somehow that he was the one who had carried her. The second one was at the table, younger, tall and lean, with hair the color of dark wheat, and eyes she would later learn were a shade of amber, almost gold, in the firelight. He was oiling a long Winchester rifle with slow, careful strokes of a flannel rag. He looked up when she moved his gaze, level and quiet, and then he looked back down at his work. He had not introduced himself. He would not, she sensed, until the moment was right. The third one was crouched by an iron stove against the far wall, stirring a pot. He was the youngest of them, perhaps 30. His shoulders were broad too, but there was a softness in his face the others did not have, a readiness to smile, a brightness in the set of his mouth. His hands were dark from the forge. He glanced up as she stirred, and when their eyes met his, crinkled at the corners. He did not look away. She tried to sit up. The room turned slowly like a wagon wheel starting to roll, and she let her head fall back against the pillow. "Slow now," said the youngest one. His voice was warm. "We thought you were gone, ma'am. You were as cold as creek ice when my brother brought you in. You take it slow." Brother. So they were brothers. The big one by the fire had not turned. He spoke now without looking. His voice was deep and quiet, and there was no warmth in it, only the level honesty of a man who has spent many years saying exactly what he means and nothing more. "You are at the Ashford cabin, ma'am. Bitter Root Range, 40 miles above Bitter Creek. I am Hollis Ashford. The man at the table is my brother Beckett. The one at the stove is our youngest Whitaker. We call him Whit. We pulled you out of a drift about a mile down the south slope. Another quarter hour, and we would not have got you up at all." She tried to speak. Her throat was raw. I thank you, sir. Mr. Ashford. I am. Adelaide Pemberton, said Beckett quietly from the table. He did not look up from his rifle. "We found the letter in your hand, from Theodore." The name dropped into the room like a stone into a still pond. The 3 brothers went very still. The fire popped. The wind, somewhere far above the cabin, gave a low, long howl and then settled. Hollis Ashford finally turned in his chair. His face in the firelight was not what she had expected. It was a hard face, weathered lined at the eyes, marked by a faded scar that ran along his left jaw and disappeared into his beard. But it was a face that had once been gentle, and the gentleness was still there, buried like a vein of soft silver in a granite cliff. His eyes were the color of old whiskey held up to a lantern. They studied her without judgment and without warmth. Theodore Ashford was our cousin, ma'am, our father's youngest brother's only son. He lived down in Bitter Creek. He kept a small store. We did not know he had sent for a bride. He did not see fit to tell us. Wit at the stove made a small sound that was almost a laugh and almost a wince. That was a Theodore thing to do, he said softly, and then he said no more. Adelaide felt the last of her strength leak out of her. She lay back against the furs. Tears she had not allowed on the platform, tears she had not allowed on the road, came now without her permission sliding sideways down her temples into her hair. She did not sob. She did not make a sound. She only let them come. I have nowhere to go, she said at last. I have $3 in my purse. My family is buried in Boston. Theodore was. Theodore was all I had left. The cabin was quiet for a long time. Then Hollis Ashford stood up. He was even larger standing than sitting. He filled the room. He crossed to the stove and ladled out a tin cup of broth, and he brought it to her, and he set it on the small stool by her bed. He did not touch her hand. He did not sit down. He stood there for a moment looking down at her, and she looked up at him, and something passed between them that neither of them could yet have named. Drink, he said, slow, then sleep. We will talk in the morning. And then he turned and walked out the front door of the cabin and into the storm without his coat. And he did not come back inside for a long time. That first night she did not dream. She woke once in the deep middle hours and saw a single figure sitting in the oak chair by the fire. It was Hollis. He was not moving. He was holding something in his hands, something small, and he was looking at it the way a man looks at a grave, a small wooden horse, the same one that had stood on the mantel. She watched him for a long minute through her lashes, and then she slept again, and in the morning she would not be sure if she had truly seen it or only dreamed it. Morning. The light came gray through the shuttered windows. The fire had been built up to a roar. The smell of coffee, real coffee, filled the cabin, and so did the smell of frying salt pork and fresh biscuits. Wit was at the stove again, humming softly a tune she half recognized from a hymnal back east. Beckett was sharpening a long knife at the table, the whetstone sliding across the steel in a slow rhythm. Hollis was nowhere to be seen. Adelaide sat up. She was wearing a man's flannel shirt far too large for her, and a wool union suit beneath it. Her dress, washed and dried, hung folded over a chair near the fire. She did not need to ask who had changed her. She knew by the careful folding that it had been done with the brothers' eyes turned away. They had wrapped her in a robe to bring her home, and the cold had done the rest of the work for them, and her dignity had been kept by men who understood what dignity was worth. The front door swung open. Hollis came in on a blast of cold air, stamping snow off his boots. He had been outside for hours. His beard was white with frost. His face was the color of weathered oak. He shut the door behind him with his shoulder and dropped a load of split firewood into the wood box with a heavy, controlled crash. He looked at Beckett. The pass is gone, he said. Beckett stopped sharpening. He laid the knife down. How bad? Avalanche came off the south face sometime in the night. 20 feet of packed snow and rock across the saddle. We will not move a wagon through there before April. And no man on foot is getting down through that neither, not without breaking his neck on the first ledge. Wit set the spatula down on the stove. The humming had stopped. The three brothers stood for a long moment in silence, none of them looking at Adelaide. Then Hollis turned to her. His eyes were tired. His voice was even. Miss Pemberton, the road to Bitter Creek is closed. It will not open again until the thaw. That is 4 months, maybe 4.5. There is no way down. There is no way out. She held his gaze. She did not look away. I understand, sir. I do not think you do. He pulled off his gloves slowly, finger by finger. We have lived alone up here, the three of us, for 4 winters now. We have not had a woman under this roof since... He stopped. He did not finish the sentence. Since a long time ago, he said, we are not set up for company. We are not set up for a lady. I will earn my keep, sir. He looked at her then with something close to surprise. She did not realize in that moment how few people in his life had ever spoken to him plainly. Most people, she would later learn, were afraid of Hollis Ashford. He stood 6'5" in his stocking feet, and the silence on him was the silence that came off the mountain itself, and most folk did not know how to meet it. Adelaide met it. I can sew, sir. I can cook. My father was a schoolmaster. I can read and write and figure, and I can teach those skills to anyone who wants to learn them. I am stronger than I look. I am not afraid of work. I am not afraid of cold. I will earn every meal I take from this house. Beckett at the table made a small sound that might have been a laugh in another man. Hollis did not smile. but the line of his jaw shifted just a fraction, the way the shoulder of a granite cliff shifts when the dawnlight first touches it. "Wit," he said, "set another plate." That morning, while she ate her first hot meal in 2 days, Hollis Ashford laid a single sheet of cream-colored paper on the table in front of her. He had written on it in a square, plain hand, the hand of a man who had been taught to write but who did not write often, a contract. "You sleep in the back room," he said. "There is a bolt on the inside. You will use it. We sleep out here. Beckett and I in the lean-to off the kitchen. Wit by the fire. You will not enter our quarters. We will not enter yours. You will cook. We will hunt and chop. You will not handle our rifles or our traps. You will not go outside the cabin alone, not for any reason, not in this season. The wolves are down. The cold can kill a body in 20 minutes. You will stay inside the dooryard at all times, unless one of us is with you. When the thaw comes in April, we will see you safely down to Bitter Creek, and we will set you up with passage east or with honest work in town, whichever you prefer. There will be no obligations beyond this agreement, not from you, not from us. Are these terms acceptable, Miss Pemberton?" She read it through twice. Her hands did not shake. She picked up the steel pen he had set beside the paper, dipped it in the small bottle of ink, and signed her name in a fine, slanting script that surprised all three of them. "Adelaide May Pemberton, Boston, Massachusetts, December the 18th, 1878. Hollis Ashford stared at the signature for a long moment. "You write a fine hand, ma'am." "My father taught me, sir. He taught everyone in our parish who wished to learn. I helped him from the time I was 8 years old." Beckett at the table set down his whetstone. "You can read then. And write." "Yes, sir." He looked at his older brother. Hollis looked back at him. Something passed between the two of them, a long, unspoken thing. Beckett had been mostly self-taught. He could read slowly. Hollis could read well enough, having learned from their mother before she died. But with the youngest, who had lost her too young to remember her teaching, could neither read nor write. It was a thing the brothers did not speak of. It was a thing each of them carried as a small private shame. Adelaide saw none of this yet. She saw only that the room had gone still. "It is a gift," she said softly of her own accord. "To be able to read, I would gladly teach, sir, if anyone in this house wished to learn. As payment toward my keep." The three brothers looked at one another. Wit smiled, then slow and bright and true, and it was the first real smile Adelaide had seen in this cabin, and she would remember it for the rest of her life. "We will think on it," said Hollis. He stood up from the table. He picked up his coat. He went to the door. "Beckett with me. We have got to break the path to the woodshed before this drift hardens. Wit, you stay with the lady. See, she has what she needs." He paused at the door. He turned and he looked at Adelaide one last time, and his amber eyes held hers across the bright kitchen for the space of 2 heartbeats. Then he was gone, and Beckett with him, and the door swung shut against the wind. Wit poured her a second cup of coffee. "Welcome to the mountain, ma'am," he said softly. "Winter always ends. You remember that. Up here, when everything else seems hard, you remember that. Winter always ends." She held the warm cup in both hands. She looked at the small wooden horse on the mantelpiece. She looked at the fire. She thought of her mother's cameo still pinned to the dress folded on the chair. She thought of $3.70. She thought of a man who had carried her through a blizzard and put her down in a warm bed and walked back out into the snow without his coat because he did not know what else to do with the feeling of having saved her. Outside, the wind came down off the high peaks and circled the cabin, but the cabin held the way it had held for 37 winters, now the way Cornelius Ashford had built it to hold when he had laid the first foundation log in the spring of 1841. Inside by the fire, a young woman and the youngest of 3 mountain men sat in the kind of quiet that does not require words. Outside in the deep snow, a sleigh was already being readied in the town of Bitter Creek, and Mortimer Holloway was already studying a map of the Bitterroot Range, and his finger was already tracing a faint side trail that locals knew about and outsiders did not. The narrator's voice came down soft and patient, the way it does at the end of a long evening when the listener has settled in. She had until the spring thaw to decide what kind of woman she would become on this mountain. She had 4 months under one roof with 3 men she did not yet know. She had a contract on a sheet of cream-colored paper signed in her own slanting hand. She did not yet know that Theodore Ashford had been a coward, and that he had written to her under false pretenses, and that there were letters in a wooden box in the back of the woodshed that would change everything she thought she knew about why she had been brought here. She did not yet know that the man with the beaver pelt coat would find a way back up this mountain before the new year. She did not yet know about the small wooden horse on the mantel or the boy whose hand had once held it. She did not know any of it, but she had been pulled out of a snowdrift by a man whose name was Hollis Ashford, and she had eaten a hot breakfast in a cabin built by a man named Cornelius, and she had signed her name with her father's pen hand in the wilderness in the deep of a Montana winter in the year of our Lord, 1878. The mountain had its own way of choosing people. Friend, you stay with us. The story is only just beginning. The fire is built up high. The coffee pot is full. And outside the cabin door, the snow keeps falling the way it has always fallen on the high country, the way it will fall on the brave and the foolish and the ones who came west looking for a home. Stay with us a while longer. The wind is rising. The first week passed slowly, the way deep winter passes everywhere in the high country. Time on the mountain did not move by hours. It moved by the work that got done and the work that did not, by the height of the sun against the south ridge at noon, by the way the shadows of the pines lengthened across the snow before supper time. Adelaide Pemberton learned this rhythm without being told. She had grown up the daughter of a parish schoolmaster in Boston, and she had never spent a winter outside a brick row house, and yet some part of her understood the rhythm of the cabin from the very first morning. She rose when she heard the back door open and Hollis carrying in firewood. She took her place at the stove when she heard Whit moving the kettle. She kept out of the way when Beckett came in, stamping snow off his boots with a brace of frozen rabbits over his shoulder. The cabin was larger than she had first realized. The main room was the heart of it, broad and high, with the great stone hearth at one end and the iron cook stove at the other. Between them stood the long pine table where the brothers ate, where they cleaned their guns, where they mended their gear in the long evenings. A sleeping loft ran along the back wall, reached by a wooden ladder, but no one slept up there in winter. It was too cold once the fire died down. The brothers had built two small lean-to rooms off the back of the kitchen, one for Hollis and Beckett to share, and a smaller storeroom that had now been given to her. Her room had a narrow rope bed strung with elk hide, a small chest of pine planks, and a window the size of a cookbook with two sets of shutters. Whit had nailed a leather strap and a hand-carved bolt to the inside of her door on the first morning before breakfast without being asked. Beyond the cabin proper, by way of a covered breezeway, stood the rest of the homestead. The woodshed was stacked from floor to roof beam with split lodge pole and seasoned tamarack. The smokehouse held venison and elk, and one whole side of bear, all of it dark and dry and good. The springhouse, half buried in the slope, kept the cream and the salt pork. The barn beyond housed two enormous Belgian draft horses named Hank and Bessie, three milk goats with frost on their whiskers, a flock of 14 hens, and a single brown milk cow named Patience, who had earned her name. And tacked onto the side of the barn was Whit's forge, with its small brick hearth, its anvil, its quenching trough, and the dark soot that had blackened the rafters above it for 15 years. Cornelius Ashford had built the first one-room cabin in the spring of 1841. He had brought a wife named Mary out from Pennsylvania, and she had borne him 3 sons in this house, one in 1842, one in 1845, one in 1848, and she had died of a pneumonia in the winter of 1855 when Whit was only 6. Cornelius had buried her under the great cedar at the south corner of the dooryard, and he had built her a marker out of field stone, and he had not married again. He had raised the 3 boys himself with the help of an old trapper named Eben, who came by twice a year, and he had passed in his sleep in the autumn of 1869. The brothers had been 27, 24, and 21, and they had buried their father beside their mother under the cedar, and they had simply gone on. None of them had ever lived anywhere else. Adelaide learned all this in pieces over many evenings, sitting by the fire while one or another of them spoke. They were not talkative men, they did not waste words, but over the long winter nights the words came out slow and careful, the way a man pulls a fish hook out of his thumb, working it free. By the end of the first week, she had taken over the cooking entirely. The brothers ate before her arrival the way men eat, who have stopped caring whether food is anything more than fuel. Boiled jerky, beans with lard, hard biscuit, coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. She had no quarrel with any of it, but she also found on the 3rd day a sack of yellow onions sprouting in a corner of the spring house, and a tin of dried sage and thyme that had been pushed behind a row of nail jars, and a wheel of hard yellow cheese wrapped in waxed cloth that no one seemed to remember buying. From these forgotten things, she made on the 4th night a venison stew with caramelized onion and sage gravy, fresh sourdough biscuits, flaky enough to come apart in layers, and a panful of fried apples with cinnamon for after. Beckett ate 3 biscuits without speaking. Whit ate 4. Hollis Ashford, who had not finished a full plate at his own table in 2 years, scraped his plate clean and pushed it away and looked across the table at her with something in his eyes that he did not yet have the words for. "It is fit to eat, ma'am," he said. It was the highest compliment he knew how to give. Whit beside him snorted into his coffee. "Fit to eat. Brother, that is the finest meal that has crossed this table since Mama was alive, and you know it." Hollis did not answer, but that night when Adelaide went to her small back room, she found that someone had slipped a second wool blanket onto her bed while she was washing dishes. It was the heavy gray wool trade blanket from the foot of Hollis's own bedroll. She held it for a long moment in the dark before she lay down. She did not say anything about it in the morning, neither did he. By the second week, the brothers had given her, without quite meaning to, the run of the kitchen and the pantry. By the third week, they had given her the run of the breezeway and the spring house. By the fourth week, she was milking Patience the brown cow each morning while Whit cleaned the stalls, and she could tell the milk goats apart by their voices alone, and she had named the boldest of the hens Henrietta and the meekest one Ruth. She also began to understand the brothers as separate men. Beckett, the middle one, was the quietest. He spoke perhaps 10 sentences a day, but he watched everything. He saw on her second morning that she shivered when she sat too long away from the fire, and he moved her chair without comment. He saw on her fourth morning that she had bitten her lip raw in her sleep, and he set a small tin of beeswax salve beside her plate at breakfast without saying a word. He could read tracks the way a city man read a newspaper. He could tell from a single hoof print in the snow whether the elk was moving fast or slow, whether it was a cow or a bull, how long ago it had passed, and whether it was alone or part of a herd. In the evenings, he would take down a small leather case from a shelf above the mantel, and he would draw out a harmonica that had been his father's, and he would play. He played slow, old Pennsylvania tunes that Cornelius had taught him in the years before his hands grew too stiff to hold the instrument. He played Shenandoah. He played Lorena. He played a slow, soft tune called The Parting Glass, and the cabin would go quiet, and the wind outside would seem to slow. Whit, the youngest, was the warmest. He laughed, easiest, smiled longest, and brought the most light into a room simply by walking into it. He was 30 years old, and he was the closest thing to an open door that the cabin had. He worked the forge 2 days a week, mostly mending broken tools and rebuilding the iron rims of the wagon wheels that the cold ate at every winter. His hands were always dark with soot, and he had a habit of forgetting and pushing his hair out of his eyes with the back of his wrist, leaving a smudge across his forehead that Adelaide by the second week had taken to wiping off with the corner of her apron without thinking. He had been engaged once 3 years before, a girl named Cordelia Vance, the schoolmaster's daughter from Helena, who had spent a summer with cousins in Bitter Creek and met Whit at a church social and promised herself to him by the end of August. She had ridden the train back to Helena that September to settle her affairs, and she had married a Chicago grain merchant by Thanksgiving. Whit had not gone down to a town social since. He had not spoken her name in 3 years, but Beckett had told Adelaide about it one evening in 3 short sentences in a voice that said he had been waiting for the right person to tell. And then there was Hollis. Hollis Ashford was the oldest, and he was the one she could not yet read. He was 36 years old. He stood 6 foot 5 inches in his stocking feet, and the depth of him was greater than the height. His shoulders had been built by 20 years of axe work and lifting and hauling, and his hands were a country of their own, scarred and split and capable of cradling a porcelain coffee cup without the cup ever being aware that it was held. He had a long, faded mark along his left jaw from a grizzly that had charged him at the age of 19, and he had killed that grizzly with a hunting knife after he had emptied his rifle into it, and he had walked 4 miles back to the cabin afterward with his shoulder torn open. He kept a small leather Bible in the breast pocket of his shirt at all hours. It had belonged to his mother. The pages were worn so soft they felt like cloth. He read from it sometimes by the fire when he thought she had gone to bed. He did not speak to her unless he had to. He did not look at her if he could help it, and yet she began to notice in small ways that he was always near her. When she went to the spring house for milk, he was suddenly chopping wood within sight of the path. When she went to the barn to gather eggs, he was suddenly mending a stall door 3 stalls down. He never followed her openly. He never offered her his arm, but he was always there. The mountain held many things that could kill a body. Hollis Ashford had decided, without ever announcing it, that none of those things would reach her. In the second week, she began the lessons. She did not propose them. She simply set out one evening after supper a small wooden board that Whit had planned smooth a stick of charcoal and a clean rag. She wrote the alphabet across the top of the board in a slow, careful hand, and she sat down by the fire with it on her lap and waited. Whit came over first. He sat down on the bench beside her, big shoulders curled forward, and he took the charcoal stick in his great soot-blackened hand, the way a man takes a wild bird, and he tried to copy the letter A. His A came out crooked. He laughed at himself. He tried again. The second one was worse. He laughed harder. By the end of the evening, he had written his own name, Whitaker Ashford, in shaky, uneven capitals all the way across the bottom of the board, and he sat looking at it for a long minute, and his eyes were shining. "I am 30 years old, ma'am," he said. "I have lived on this mountain my whole life, and that is the first time I have ever wrote my own name." Beckett came over the next night. He could read a little, he said quietly. Mary had begun his lessons one winter when he was small before the pneumonia took her. He had kept it up in patches by candlelight with a single battered copy of Pilgrim's Progress that had belonged to her, but he had never been taught to write properly. He sat down at the table with a sheet of butcher paper, and Adelaide showed him the loops of cursive, the slant of the lowercase letters, the way the pen lifts between certain pairs and not others. He learned faster than wit. Within 3 nights, he could write a clean grocery list. Within a week, he had begun to copy passages out of the Bible into a small leather notebook of his own. He never showed her what he wrote, but sometimes late at night she would hear the soft scratch of a pen in the main room, and she would know that he was at the table working alone. Hollis did not come to the lessons. He stayed by the fire on those evenings in his oak chair with his face turned toward the flames. He listened to every word she said, and Adelaide noticed on the third such evening that the chair had been moved. It had been turned a few inches, just enough that if he chose, he could see the table out of the corner of his eye. He could hear his brothers writing their names. He never asked to join. He never came to the bench, but he was attending, and once in the deep middle of one such night when she had thought the whole cabin asleep, she had risen for a cup of water and seen him in his chair by the dying coals, holding the small wooden board on his knee, tracing the letters with the tip of one enormous calloused finger, slowly alone. She did not let him see her see him. She went back to bed in the dark. It was on a gray afternoon late in the third week that she found the wooden horse. She had been dusting the mantelpiece. She had taken down the heavy iron skillet that hung from a peg there, and she had reached behind it with a clean rag, and her fingers had closed on something small and smooth and old. She drew it out into the firelight. It was a horse carved from a single piece of dark cedar. The mane streamed back as if in a wind that no longer blew. The legs were caught in mid-gallop, the off forefoot raised. The head turned a quarter to one side as if listening. It had been carved with the patience of a man who loved the thing he was making. But what struck her hardest was not the carving, it was the wear. The wood along the belly and the back was darkened almost to black, and worn perfectly smooth, the way a stone in a creek bed is worn by water over many years. This little horse had been held. It had been held by a small hand, a child's hand every day, for perhaps 2 years, until the oils of that small hand had soaked into the cedar and changed it forever. The front door opened. Adelaide turned the horse still in her open palm, and she met the eyes of Hollis Ashford across the room. The color drained out of his face. He did not speak. He did not move. He stood in the doorway with snow on his shoulders and the cold air rolling in around his boots, and he looked at her holding that small wooden horse, and his face went the color of old ash beneath his beard. I am sorry," she said quickly. "I did not mean. I was only dusting. I will put it back." He did not answer. "Hollis," she said more softly, "I will put it back." He took one step into the cabin. He shut the door behind him with great care, as if any louder sound would break something. He crossed the room in 4 strides. He did not take the horse from her. He looked at it in her hand for a long moment. His huge scarred hand came up, and for an instant she thought he meant to take it from her, but instead he simply touched the carved mane with the tip of one finger. Just once. Just for a heartbeat. Then he turned and he walked out the back door of the cabin without speaking, and a moment later she heard his axe begin against the chopping block. He chopped wood for the next hour and a half. He chopped long after the wood box was full. He chopped until the sun went down behind the south ridge, and the mountain went blue and then black, and the temperature began to drop again. She put the small wooden horse back exactly where she had found it, behind the iron skillet, in the shadow. That evening, after supper, Whit waited until Hollis had gone out to check the barn. Then he sat down on the bench beside her by the fire. He did not look at her. He looked into the flames. His name was Elias, ma'am, he said quietly. Elias Ashford. He was 5 years old. He had hair the color of wheat in August, and he had his mama's laugh. Adelaide did not move. She did not speak. Whit went on. His mama was Lenora. Hollis married her in the autumn of 1872. She was a school teacher down in Helena. She had come up to Bitter Creek to keep the school here for one term, and Hollis met her at the spring social, and Whit smiled faintly at some old memory. He courted her like a man on fire. He had never courted anyone before in his life. She said yes within the year. They were married in the fall. Elias was born the next summer. Whit was quiet for a moment. In the spring of '74, Lenora's sister sent word she was sick over in Livingston. Lenora wanted to take Elias to see her. Hollis did not want them to go alone, so he took them. They traveled by wagon down to the Yellowstone, then meant to take a flatboat across to the eastern bank where the road to Livingston ran. The boat was an old one. The river was high with the spring melt. The pilot was a man who should have known better. He stopped. She waited. The boat broke up about 100 yards out, ma'am. The current took it. Hollis got Lenora to a snag in the middle of the river, but she had hit her head when the boat went over and she was not conscious. He could not hold her and Elias both. The boy was being swept past him. He let go of his wife to grab his son. He had Elias by the wrist for almost a minute. The water tore him loose. Hollis went under the snag trying to follow, and he came up half a mile downstream with nothing in his hands. They found Lenora that evening, snagged on a sandbar. They never found Elias. Witt's voice was very steady but very low. That was 4 years and 7 months ago, ma'am. Hollis came back up to the cabin 2 weeks after the funerals. He has not been down off this mountain since. Not once. Not for any reason. Beckett and I do the trips into Bitter Creek now. We tried in the first year to get him to come down even just to the lower meadow. He would not. He said the mountain was the only thing big enough to hold what he had to carry. He said he was going to stay up here until he was ready to walk down to that river again. Witt looked at her then. He has not been ready, ma'am. 4 years and 7 months. He has not been ready. Adelaide did not answer. She could not. She sat beside him by the fire for a long time looking at the flames, and after a while, Witt got up and went into the lean-to to fetch a fresh log, and she was alone with the fire and with the small wooden horse hidden behind the iron skillet on the mantel, and she pressed both her hands over her mouth and did not let herself make any sound at all. The week that followed was a quiet one. Hollis did not speak of the horse. Adelaide did not bring it up. But something in the cabin had shifted the way a great stone shifts a quarter inch in the foundation of a house where no one can see it but everyone can feel it. He still did not look at her at the table, but he passed her the bread plate now when before he had let Witt do it. He still chopped wood within sight of the path. But sometimes when she came out of the spring house, he was already standing there with his hand out for the milk pail, and he carried it back to the cabin for her without comment, and he set it on the table without comment, and he went back outside without comment, and her hand had brushed his only once as the pail changed hands, and they had both gone very still for the space of one breath, and then he had turned away. The first knock at the cabin door came on the 10th day after the wooden horse. It came in the late afternoon. The light was already thinning. The sun had gone behind the south ridge an hour before, and the temperature was beginning its long evening fall. The brothers were all inside. Beckett was at the table cleaning the long Sharps rifle. Witt was at the stove. Hollis was reading of all things by the fire. He had taken down a battered volume of Walter Scott, and he had been reading it for 40 minutes without turning a page, and Adelaide had pretended not to notice this. 3 sharp knocks. Every man in the room moved at once. Beckett laid the Sharps down and stood. Witt set the spoon aside and reached up to the rack above the door for a second rifle. Hollis closed the book carefully, set it on the arm of his chair, and rose to his full height. He crossed to the door. He did not open it. Who is there? The voice on the other side of the door was smooth and cultivated. It was a voice Adelaide had heard only once before in her life, but she would have known it in her grave. Mortimer Holloway, of the Bitter Creek Bank. I have business with Miss Pemberton. Hollis did not move for the space of 3 slow heartbeats. Then he turned to Adelaide. His amber eyes met hers across the room. There was no surprise in them. There was no fear. There was only a question, and the question was, do you want me to open this door, or do you want me to send him away? Adelaide stood up slowly from her chair. Open it, she said. Witt moved to her side and stayed there. Beckett stepped to the wall by the door, out of sight of whoever was on the other side, and he held the long Sharps rifle low and easy in his hands. Hollis lifted the bar from the door and swung it open. Mortimer Holloway stood on the porch in his beaver pelt coat and his yellow leather gloves. Behind him, 10 paces back, stood 4 men. They were not town men. Their coats were dark and shabby. 2 of them carried short shotguns. The other 2 carried knives openly on their belts. They held a sleigh by its harness, and the 2 horses in front of it were lathered and steaming in the cold. Holloway smiled. It was the same smile he had given her on the platform at Bitter Creek. Miss Pemberton. So good to find you in good health. May I come in? You may not, said Hollis Ashford. Holloway looked up at him, his smile thinned by a quarter. He had not realized until this moment how much larger Hollis was than himself. Some men go their whole lives without learning that lesson. Holloway was learning it now in the doorway of a cabin 40 miles from any sheriff. I am here on a matter of law, Mr. Ashford. Theodore Ashford, your cousin, died owing my bank $300 under the Montana Territorial Act of 1875 concerning betrothed women and inherited obligations. His intended has assumed certain of those debts, or alternatively, certain of those obligations may be discharged by other means. I have come to discuss the matter with the lady. There are options, you understand. There are always options. Hollis did not move from the doorway. He filled it the way a man fills a doorway who does not intend to be moved. You will not discuss any matter with the lady today, sir. I beg your pardon. You will turn your sleigh, said Hollis quietly, and you will go back down the south trail the way you came, and you will not return to this property without a sheriff and a written warrant, and even then you will not lay a hand upon her so long as I am drawing breath. Do you understand me, Mr. Holloway? The four men behind Holloway shifted. One of them put his hand on the stock of his shotgun. Beckett, behind the door, lifted the sharps a quiet inch. Holloway saw the movement. Holloway was a coward, and like most cowards, he had a fine instinct for the precise moment at which his plan stopped being a plan and started being a grave. He saw four men on a porch. He saw a man the size of Hollis Ashford in a doorway. He saw the long blue barrel of a Sharps rifle just visible at waist height inside the cabin. He smiled again. The smile did not quite work. Of course, a misunderstanding. I shall return in the spring with the proper papers. Miss Pemberton. He looked past Hollis at her, then, in his pond water eyes locked onto hers, and he tipped his hat with elaborate courtesy. The thaw will come, my dear, he said softly. It always comes. And when it does, we shall continue our conversation from the platform. I do so look forward to it. He turned, he climbed back into his sleigh. The four men climbed up around him. The driver wheeled the team, and the sleigh slid back down the trail in a wide curve, and the runners hissed against the snow, and within 5 minutes they were a black spot disappearing into the gray of the evening, and then they were gone. Hollis closed the door. He let down the bar. He turned around in the firelight, and Adelaide saw for the first time since she had known him that the line of his jaw was trembling, not from fear, from rage, a clean, cold, perfectly contained rage held tight against his ribs the way a man holds a wounded animal. Beckett laid the sharps down on the table. Wit very softly said, well. Hollis crossed the room in 3 strides. He stopped in front of Adelaide. He looked down at her. He was so much taller than she was that she had to tilt her chin up to meet his eyes. His enormous hand came up, and for one suspended breath she did not know what he was going to do, and then he laid his hand very gently against the side of her face. The palm covered her cheekbone and her temple. His thumb rested at the corner of her jaw. His skin was warm and rough and smelled of cedar smoke. He did not say a word. He held her face for the space of perhaps 4 heartbeats. Then he took his hand away. A man like that, he said quietly, will not have you. Not while I am breathing on this mountain. He turned and walked out the back door of the cabin and into the deepening dusk to chop wood that did not need chopping. That night, Adelaide did not bolt her door. She did not decide not to. She simply did not. She lay in the dark in her small back room under the gray wool blanket that he had slipped onto her bed in the 2nd week, and she listened to the soft sounds of the cabin settling into night, the fire popping in the hearth, Beckett's slow breathing across the breezeway, Witt's low humming as he banked the coals, Hollis somewhere outside the rhythm of the axe against the chopping block on and on into the great cold. She thought of the shape of his hand against her cheek. She thought of a small wooden horse on a mantle. She thought of $3.70 in a purse she no longer carried. She thought of a man who did not know yet that he was already in love, and a man who had ridden a fine sleigh up a side trail that no outsider should have known, and a buried boy of 5 years old whose hair had been the color of wheat in August. The narrator's voice came down soft and slow, the way it does when the night is long and the fire is high. She had come to this mountain to marry a stranger. She had found instead 3 brothers, a contract on a sheet of cream-colored paper, and the slow work of a winter that was teaching her hour by hour who she truly was. The man with the beaver pelt coat would come back. She knew that now. He had said so himself. And in a wooden box somewhere in the back of the woodshed there were letters in Theodore Ashford's hand that she had not yet found, letters that would tear the floor out from under everything she thought she knew about why she had been brought west. But that night, in the soft dark of the cabin, Adelaide May Pemberton turned her face toward the wall, and she did not bolt her door, and she let herself think for the first time since Boston that perhaps she was not entirely alone in the world after all. Outside the wind rose, outside the snow began again. Outside, the man named Hollis Ashford finally stopped chopping wood. He stood in the dooryard with the axe head resting in the snow, and he looked up at the great wheel of stars over the Bitterroot Range, and he said something so quietly that no one but the mountain heard it. The mountain heard it. The mountain remembered. Friends, stay with us. The fire is still high, and the night is long, and the story is just past its first turning. There is more snow coming. There are letters yet to be found. There is a little wooden horse on a mantle that will yet be lifted down in a quieter hour into a different pair of hands. And there is a man on this mountain who has not been ready for 4 years and 7 months, who is closer now by inches to being ready than he has been since the day the river took everything he loved. Stay close to the fire. The wind is rising again. The morning after Mortimer Holloway came up the mountain, the wind died. It did not die slowly the way a fire dies when the wood runs low. It died all at once the way a man stops talking in the middle of a sentence when he realizes no one is listening anymore. Adelaide woke before dawn to a silence so complete that she sat up in bed and listened for the sound of her own heart to be sure she was still alive. Outside the small shuttered window of her room, the world was perfectly still. No creak of timber, no groan of wind in the chimney, only a great soft quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a hard storm has passed, and the country lies under 3 feet of fresh powder holding its breath. She rose and dressed by the light of a single tallow candle. She put on the wool dress that Whit had cut down for her from one of his mother's old gowns found in a cedar chest in the loft. She pinned her hair up with 2 small bone pins. She lifted her mother's cameo brooch from the small chest by her bed, kissed it once, and pinned it at her throat. She had taken to wearing it every morning now. It was the only piece of her old life she kept on her body. She did not know yet how soon she would have to take it off again. When she came into the main room, Beckett was already at the table with a tin cup of coffee and a small leather notebook open in front of him. He had been writing. He closed the notebook quickly when she came in, the way a man closes a door in a private room. He stood and poured her coffee and set it at her place without a word. Hollis was outside. She could hear him at the woodpile, the slow, steady fall of the axe. Whit was in the barn. The fire had been built up to a low, steady heat. The cabin smelled of coffee and pine and the faint, clean smell of new snow. Adelaide stood for a moment at the window, looking out. The dooryard was a perfect blanket of white. The cedar at the south corner stood like a tall green column against the pale sky. Beneath it, half buried, were 2 fieldstone markers that she had not noticed before. She did not need to ask what they were. Beckett spoke quietly behind her. We will need more flour by the end of the month, ma'am. And some other things. I keep the inventory in this book. I always have, but I have been thinking, he paused, if you would not mind. You write a finer hand than I do, and you figure faster. Perhaps you would take the inventory over. She turned. He was holding the small leather notebook out to her across the table. It was a great gift. She understood that at once. He was not handing her a chore. He was handing her a place. He was telling her in the only way Beckett Ashford knew how to tell anyone anything, that she was no longer a guest on this mountain. She was part of how the cabin ran. She took the notebook. Thank you, Beckett. He nodded once and went back to his coffee. That was the first morning of the 5th week. It was that same week on a gray afternoon while Beckett was out checking trap lines and Whit was working at the forge that Adelaide found the letters. She had gone out to the woodshed for an armful of kindling. The woodshed was a long, low building, deeper than it looked, with the split lodgepole stacked along 3 walls and a narrow workbench at the back. On the workbench sat various odds and ends of cabin life, an old whetstone, a tin of nails, a length of harness leather, a broken stirrup waiting to be mended. And in the very back corner, half hidden behind a stack of old hides, was a small wooden box. Cherry wood, the lid carved in a simple geometric pattern, the kind of box a young man might make to hold his important things. Adelaide would not have noticed it at all, except that she had set down her armful of kindling to pick up a fallen scrap of paper from the floor, and the scrap of paper had been an envelope addressed in handwriting that she would have known in her grave. Theodore Ashford, the same slanting, careful hand that had filled 14 letters to her over 6 months in Boston. She straightened slowly, holding the envelope. The address read, "To Hollis Ashford, to be opened only in the event of my death." She stood very still in the cold of the woodshed for a long moment. Her breath made small clouds in the dim light. She knew, without yet knowing why, that her life was about to turn. She knew the way a person knows in a dream before the dream becomes terrible that something terrible is coming. She knelt down. She lifted the lid of the cherry wood box. Inside lay perhaps a dozen letters tied together with a length of brown twine. The top letter was addressed simply to Hollis. The handwriting was the same. She did not open them in the woodshed. She would not have let herself read another woman's letters to a brother, but these were not letters to a brother in the ordinary sense. These were letters from a dying man to the family he had not been brave enough to live up to, and they had her name on them. She could see her own name, Adelaide Pemberton, on at least 3 of the envelopes. She gathered the letters, tucked them into the deep pocket of her apron, and walked back to the cabin with her armful of kindling. Her hands were shaking. She did not let it show. She read the letters in her small back room with the door bolted from the inside. She read them slowly, one by one, in the order Theodore had written them. The earliest was dated June of the previous year. The latest was dated 3 weeks before his death. By the time she finished the last one, she was sitting on the floor with her back against the bed frame, and her hands were folded in her lap, and her face was wet, and she did not yet know whether she was crying from grief or from rage or from the simple shock of seeing the world she thought she lived in fall away beneath her feet. Theodore Ashford had not loved her. He had not loved anyone. The man who had written her those 14 tender letters, the man who had written about wildflowers in the high meadows and about lonely evenings and about the hope of a quiet life with a good woman, that man had been a careful creation of paper and ink. The truth Theodore had written to his cousin Hollis was different. The truth was this. Theodore Ashford had owed Mortimer Holloway $300 on a bad investment in a freight company that had failed in the autumn of '77. Theodore had been afraid of Mortimer Holloway. Holloway had pressed him. Holloway had hinted, in the way men of his kind hint, that there were ways for a debt to be forgiven if a man brought something of value to the table. Theodore had thought of the advertisements in the Eastern papers. Strong Christian woman wanted, etc. He had answered 3. He had chosen Adelaide Pemberton because her photograph showed a young woman who looked, in his exact phrase, refined enough for the purpose. He had written to her in honeyed phrases for 6 months. He had no intention of marrying her. He had intended to bring her west to introduce her to Holloway and to let the two of them come to whatever arrangement Holloway saw fit. He had been, in his own words to Hollis, a damn coward. And in the last letter, written 3 weeks before the fever took him, he had finally said the rest of it. I am dying, Hollis. The doctor will not say it, but I see it in his face. I have done a black thing. I have written to a girl in Boston under false pretenses. She is on a train west by now. If she arrives after I'm gone, I beg you, do not let Holloway near her. Do not let him have her. She is a good girl. She does not deserve what I have done to her. Go down to the depot, take her home with you, look after her until the spring, and then send her back east with the money I have set aside in the lockbox in the spring house, $60 in silver, all I have. Promise me, brother, I have not been a man worthy of our father's name, but let me die having asked one true thing of you. Promise me. The letter was unsigned. He had been too weak by then to sign it. Adelaide laid the letters down on the floor. She did not move for a long time. She thought of her mother's voice. She thought of her father's voice. She thought of the photograph that she had carried west across a continent wrapped in a handkerchief in a carpet bag. She thought of the 2 thin gold bands she had hoped one day to wear hers, and her husband's joined by a quiet ceremony in a clean little frontier church. She thought of the 14 letters in the bottom of her chest. Each one of them, she now understood, a kind of small, slow knife. She thought of Theodore lying alone in a back bedroom in Bitter Creek with a fever climbing through him, knowing what he had done, knowing she was already on a train writing one last letter in a hand that could no longer hold the pen steady, asking his cousin for one true thing. She did not know what she felt. She only knew she could not stay in that small room another minute. She rose. She unfastened the bolt. She walked out into the main room. Beckett was alone at the table, a cup of coffee in front of him, his harmonica in his hand. He looked up when she came in. His eyes went at once to her face, and his face changed. "Ma'am," he said, and stood. She held out the bundle of letters. "I found these," she said, "in the woodshed, in a cherry box." Beckett took them. He glanced down. He saw Theodore's handwriting. He sat down heavily in his chair. Hollis came in from the back at that moment, snow on his shoulders, an armful of split kindling in his arms. He stopped at the door. He looked at his brother. He looked at her face. He looked at the letters in his brother's hand. The kindling went down into the wood box more carefully than usual. Beckett rose and handed Hollis the letters. Hollis read. He read, standing up slowly in the gray light by the window. His face did not change. His mouth tightened once around the second letter and once again at the last one. When he was finished, he laid the bundle on the table with great care, as if it were a thing that might break. He looked at her. "I would have spared you this," he said quietly. "If I had known he had written it down, I would have burned them." "You knew," she said. "I knew the shape of it, ma'am. Theodore came up here in October of last year. He was sick already, though he did not know yet how sick. He confessed to me here in this room what he had done. He asked me to go down to the depot when you came and to fetch you up to the cabin no matter what. He did not write you a letter telling you the truth. He could not face it, he told me, and I gave him my word." He paused. I should have ridden out to meet you at the platform myself. I knew the train was due. I let Beckett and Whit go down for the supplies that morning instead. I told myself the storm was coming and someone needed to stay up at the cabin with the stock. The truth was that I could not bring myself to walk into Bitter Creek. I have not walked into that town in 4.5 years. I let you walk off that platform alone because I was a coward, ma'am, and you almost died for it. She had never heard him say so many words at once. She stood looking at him in the gray light. She was still angry. She was still grieving, but she was not angry at him. She understood that now with a great quiet certainty. She had been angry at Theodore. She had been angry at Mortimer Holloway. She had been angry mostly at her own younger self, the one who had read those 14 letters in a Boston boarding house and let herself believe that hope was finally going to come for her. She did not let herself believe it any longer. Or rather, she let herself believe it about something else. I am glad, she said quietly, that he asked you. And I am glad that you said yes. Whatever it cost you, sir, I am glad. Hollis did not answer. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the room very slowly and laid one enormous hand flat on the cherrywood box of letters where it sat on the table as if he meant to seal something shut. He did not lift his hand for a long time. Beckett lifted his coffee cup with a hand that was not quite steady, and Adelaide sat down at the table and gathered the letters into her lap and folded her hands over them and wept very quietly for a long time. That evening, after the supper plates were cleared, Whit came in from the forge with a small object wrapped in a square of clean flannel. He was not smiling. Whit was almost always smiling. Tonight he was not. He came over to where Adelaide sat by the fire with her mending in her lap, and he held the flannel out to her. I made you something, ma'am. I had been working on it for a few weeks. I meant to give it to you when it felt right. But after today, I thought, well, maybe today. She set down her mending and took the bundle. She unwrapped the flannel. Inside lay a small iron key, beautifully wrought. The bow of the key was shaped like a tiny chickadee wings, folded, head tilted. The shaft was simple and clean and well balanced. It fit, she realized, the new lock that Whit had quietly installed on the inside of her bedroom door the second week she was on the mountain, replacing the simple wooden bolt with a proper keyed mechanism, the kind a young woman might use in a proper house in town. This is your key, ma'am, he said softly, to your door. You keep it on you. Anyone wants in, they have to ask. Adelaide closed her hand around the small iron bird. Whit, she said. Thank you. Hollis was sitting in his oak chair across the room. He had heard every word. He did not turn his face from the fire. But Adelaide saw in the firelight the line of his jaw shift the way a man's jaw shifts when he is keeping something very carefully behind his teeth. That night, before she lay down to sleep, she fastened the key to a length of leather cord that Beckett gave her without comment, and she hung it around her neck beneath her dress, and she felt the small iron bird rest against her breastbone just below her mother's cameo. Two small things, two things to keep close, the old life and the new. The next 2 weeks passed in a hush. The cabin had absorbed something. Adelaide could feel it in the way the brothers moved around her now. They did not pity her. The Ashfords were not men who knew how to pity anyone, but they had absorbed her as a man absorbs a wound that has finally stopped bleeding. They had taken her into the household the way the household took in its winter stores, as a thing that had to be cared for and protected, but also as a thing that gave back, that fed the cabin in return, that was part of how the place would survive. She read aloud after supper now. They had asked her in their indirect way by leaving books out on the table where she could find them. She read from Walter Scott. She read from Pilgrim's Progress. She read from a battered volume of Tennyson that had been their mother's. Whit listened with his head tilted, smiling at the parts he liked. Beckett listened with his eyes half closed, sometimes nodding when a line struck him true. Hollis listened from his oak chair, his face turned slightly toward the fire, and once in the middle of a long passage about a ship returning home after a great voyage, she looked up from the page and saw him watching her, and he did not look away, and neither did she, and the line broke off in the middle, and Whit cleared his throat, and Adelaide finished the passage in a voice that was a half-tone softer than it had been. She did not let herself think about it that night, or the next, but it was there in the cabin now between them like a fourth presence at the table, a warm thing, a patient thing, a thing that had not yet been spoken. The first deep cold of the year came in the second week of January. It came down off the high country with a clarity that was almost beautiful. The thermometer Beckett kept nailed to the porch post dropped to 30 below before sunup and did not climb above 20 below all day. The air outside was so still and so cold that it cracked when a man breathed. The smoke from the chimney rose in a perfectly straight column for 100 feet before the upper wind caught it. The horse's breath in the barn made small clouds that hung in the air for a long time before fading. Even the wolves, Beckett said, did not move much in cold like this. The wolves were down in the lower valleys hunting deer. The mountain belonged for these few days to the cold itself. It was on the third morning of that deep cold that Hollis went out to check the high trap lines and did not come home at the expected hour. He had left at dawn. He had told Whit he would be back by 3 in the afternoon. By 4 o'clock, the light was already fading. By 5, it was full dark. By 6, the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees, and Beckett was lacing on his snowshoes by the fire with a face that Adelaide had not seen on him before. Whit, she said, what do we do? Whit was already at the rack pulling down the second pair of snowshoes. Beckett goes after him, ma'am. I stay with you. I am going too. Both brothers stopped and looked at her. Beckett spoke first, very gently. Ma'am, the cold out there can kill a strong man in 20 minutes if he is not moving. You have not snowshoed the high country at night. You will slow us down. I will not slow you down. I have walked the lower meadow with Whit twice this week. I can carry a lantern. I can carry the medical satchel. You and Hollis will both have your hands full if he is hurt. You need a third pair of hands. I am not asking Beckett. I am telling you. He is out there and I am coming. The two brothers looked at each other. Whit very quietly said, she has the right of it, brother. Beckett nodded once. They left within 10 minutes. Adelaide wore a borrowed pair of Whit's smaller wool trousers under her dress, 2 pairs of wool socks inside her boots, a heavy buffalo coat that had been their father's, and a fur-lined cap that came down over her ears. She carried a tin lantern in her gloved right hand and the leather medical satchel slung over her shoulder. Beckett broke trail in front. Whit came behind her. They went up the long switchback toward the high trap lines under a sky so full of stars it looked white. They found him at the bottom of a ravine 2 miles above the cabin. He had stepped onto a snow bridge over a hidden cleft of rock. The bridge had given way. He had fallen perhaps 15 feet onto the rocks below. His left ankle had broken cleanly. A jagged piece of stone had laid open his scalp above the temple. He had been there for nearly 5 hours. He had crawled to the lee of the largest boulder. He had stuffed snow into the wound on his head to slow the bleeding. He had put his hands inside his coat, against his armpits, the way a trapper teaches a young man to do when there is nothing else to be done. He had sung quietly hymns that his mother had taught him when he was a boy. He had been singing one when Beckett's lantern came over the ridge above him, and he stopped singing, and he laughed very softly in the dark. He laughed. Beckett went down the rope first. Whit anchored from above. Adelaide held the lanterns at the lip of the ravine, one in each hand, lighting the rocks below. Beckett got Hollis into the climbing harness. They hauled him up together foot by foot while the cold pressed against every inch of exposed skin like a wall. Adelaide did not feel the cold. She did not feel anything except the weight of the medical satchel against her hip and the slow beat of her own heart and the certainty that this man was not going to die tonight on a rock ledge in the Bitterroot Range, not while she was breathing, not while there was any strength left in her body to give. They got him to the top. They got him onto the makeshift sledge that Beckett had brought. They started down the trail at a half walk, half slide, the brothers taking turns guiding the sledge, Adelaide breaking trail in front now with the lantern held high because she was the lightest and could move fastest over the deep crust. It took them 3 hours to get back to the cabin. When they laid him on the long pine table in the main room, Adelaide saw him in the lantern light and felt her knees go. His lips were gray. His skin was the color of old parchment. The wound at his temple had bled through the snow and frozen against the side of his face in a dark crust. His left boot stood out at a bad angle from his leg. He was conscious. He was looking at her. His amber eyes were dim, but they were on her, and they did not leave her. Whit stripped off his coat and went to the stove to set water boiling. Beckett went to the back room for the second medical kit and a clean white sheet. Adelaide rolled up her sleeves to the elbow. She had stitched a man once before in her life. Her father, when she was 14, had cut his hand badly while carving a turkey on Christmas Day, and the doctor had been 3 streets away at another emergency, and her mother had set Adelaide to the task with a fine sewing needle and a length of silk thread and a glass of brandy. She had stitched her father's palm closed in 7 small, even stitches, and her father had told her afterward that she had the steadiest hand he had ever seen on a young woman, and that if she had been born a man, she would have made a fine surgeon. She remembered her father's hand now as she boiled the curved upholstery needle in the kettle of water. She remembered his voice. Steady, Della, slow and steady. The skin will tell you when it is right. Beckett held Hollis's head still. Whit poured a tin cup of whiskey and put it to his brother's mouth. Hollis drank. Adelaide threaded the needle with horsehair that Beckett had cleaned in alcohol, and she leaned over Hollis Ashford with the lantern at her shoulder, and she set the first stitch. He did not flinch. She set the second. The third, she worked slowly. She worked the way her father had taught her. She closed the wound at his temple in 9 clean, even stitches, and she trimmed the thread, and she pressed a clean white pad of linen against the wound, and Whip bound it in place with a strip of cotton that ran around Hollis's head. Then they set the ankle. Beckett held him at the shoulders. Whip pulled the foot. Hollis made a sound through his teeth that Adelaide would hear in her dreams for many nights afterward. The bone slid back into place. They splinted it with 2 straight pieces of pine that Whit had fetched from the woodshed. They wrapped it tight. They covered him with the gray wool blanket and the buffalo robe and a wool quilt their mother had sewn, and they built the fire up to a roar, and they did not leave him. The fever came up in the small hours. Beckett went to his bunk to sleep an hour. Whit dozed in the oak chair by the fire. Adelaide sat by the long pine table where Hollis lay with a basin of cold water and a clean cloth, and she wiped his forehead and his temples and the line of his jaw all through the night. He muttered. He turned his head from side to side. He was not awake, but he was not gone either. In the deepest hour of the night, the hour they call the wolf hour in the high country, he reached up with one enormous scarred hand and caught hold of her wrist. His grip was weak, but his fingers were certain. He did not open his eyes. "Lenora," he whispered, "the water is so fast. I cannot. Elias, hold on, son, hold on." His face was wet. He was crying in his fever sleep. Adelaide had not known it was possible to cry like that with the eyes closed. She had not known a face could carry that much grief without breaking apart. She did not pull her wrist away. She leaned down close to his ear, so close that her breath moved the dark hair at his temple. She spoke very softly in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness. "Hollis, listen to me. Listen." His head turned a fraction toward her voice. "You did all that any man could do. You had your wife in one hand and your boy in the other, and the river took them both, and there was no third hand, my dear. There was no third hand to give. You did not fail them. You did not fail anyone. The river was a wicked thing on a wicked day. It was not your hand that dropped them. Do you hear me? Listen, Hollis. You are allowed to live. You are allowed to live again. You are allowed." She did not know where the words came from. She had not planned them. She had not known until that moment that she had been carrying them inside her, ready for him. His grip on her wrist eased, his face, which had been twisted, smoothed, his breathing slowed and deepened, the crying stopped, he turned his head and his cheek came to rest against the back of her hand where it lay on the blanket beside his shoulder, and he slept, the first true sleep he had slept since the spring of '74. She stayed there until the sky began to gray at the window. When the dawn came, the fever had broken. His skin was warm, but no longer hot. His pulse was steady. The wound at his temple had set clean. The ankle would heal. He would walk again. He would chop wood and split kindling and stand in a doorway against any man who came up the South Trail. Adelaide lowered her head onto her own arm beside his shoulder and slept where she sat, half across the long pine table with her hand still resting on his. When Hollis Ashford opened his eyes in the bright, cold morning, the first thing he saw was her sleeping face inches from his own. Her honey blonde hair had come loose from its pins in the night. Her dark lashes lay still against her cheek. Her mother's cameo had turned at her throat, and beside it on its leather cord, the small iron chickadee Whit had forged her rose and fell with her breathing. He did not move. He did not wake her. He looked at her for a long time. He looked at her the way a man looks at the first warm light coming over a winter ridge after a night he was not sure he would live to see the end of. Then very slowly, very gently, he took her small hand from where it lay on his shoulder and lifted it the few inches to his mouth and pressed his lips once against her open palm. He laid her hand back down. He closed his eyes again and he slept. The narrator's voice came down low and slow, the way a fire settles in the deep hours of a long night. She had stitched him closed. She had told him in the dark the one true thing he had needed to hear for 4 years and 7 months, and somewhere in the deep country of his fever he had heard it, and the river had begun at long last to let him go. She did not know yet that he had kissed her palm in the gray light. She would not know it for a long time. But the mountain knew, and the cabin knew, and on the mantelpiece behind the iron skillet a small wooden horse waited in the firelight for a hand that was by inches learning how to lift it down again. Friend, the night is deep and the fire is high. Stay close. The hardest cold of the winter is still ahead of us. The wolves are coming down. The man in the beaver pelt coat is studying his maps. And there is a young woman on this mountain who has not yet learned what she is willing to give up and what she is not to keep the man she has begun to love. But she will learn. The wind is rising. Stay with us by the fire. Hollis Ashford healed slowly the way a great oak heals after lightning has struck it. The ankle was the first to come right. By the end of the second week, he was up and moving on a hand-carved crutch that Whit had shaped from a single piece of dry tamarack. By the end of the third week, he was walking without it, though, with a heavy limp that would not leave him until well into spring. The wound at his temple set clean and faded into a thin pink line that ran up into his hairline. He kept the stitches in for 9 days. Adelaide cut them out herself with a small pair of embroidery scissors, her hands as steady as her father had once said they were, and Hollis sat on a stool by the fire and held very still while she worked, and he did not look at her while she did it, and she did not look at him, but the silence between them while she worked had a weight to it that neither of them tried to name. Early February came and went on the mountain almost without notice. They did not speak of it on the day. The brothers did not exchange gifts among themselves, had not for many years. But Adelaide, on a quiet evening, soon after the deep cold, baked an apple pie out of the last of the dried apples in a tin of honey she had found at the back of the spring house, and she set it on the table after supper with 3 forks, and Whit grinned the way she had not seen him grin since she had come into the cabin, and Beckett laughed out loud, an honest, deep laugh that surprised him as much as it surprised her, and Hollis ate 2 slices and pushed the empty plate away and looked across the table at her and said very quietly, "Thank you, ma'am," and meant it. That night, after the others had gone to bed, Adelaide stayed up a little longer by the fire. She had not heard the cabin so quiet in a long time. The wind had laid down again. The wolves were silent down in the lower valleys. The only sound was the slow tick of the cooling stove and the soft pop of a single ember in the hearth. Hollis came back into the main room. She had thought he was asleep. He moved on his bad ankle without a sound, the way a man moves when he has spent his life not waking those he loves. He stood in the doorway of the lean-to for a moment looking at her by the firelight. Then he crossed the room. He went to the mantelpiece. He reached up behind the iron skillet and he drew down the small wooden horse and he held it for a long moment in his enormous hand. Then he turned and he came over to her bench by the fire and he sat down beside her with the horse on his knee. He did not speak for a long time. Adelaide did not move. His name was Elias, he said at last. After my father's father, he was born in July of 73. He had his mother's laugh. He had my mother's eyes. He could ride a horse before he could properly walk. I carved this for him on his 4th birthday. He carried it with him every day. He had it in his pocket the day we set out for Livingston. They never found him, ma'am. They never found him. And I have not been able to look at this thing for 4 years and 7 months without feeling as though somebody had put a knife in my chest and was slowly turning it. His voice did not break, but his hand holding the small horse was not entirely steady. Adelaide laid her hand very gently on top of his. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. He turned his hand under hers. His palm came up against her palm. The small wooden horse lay between them on his other thigh. He closed his great calloused fingers around hers slowly, the way a man closes a door he is not sure he is allowed to close, and she let her fingers curl into the spaces between his, and they sat that way by the fire for a long time, neither of them speaking, while the cabin slept around them, and the small wooden horse with its mane streaming in a wind that no longer blew rested between them like a child sleeping safe at last. When she went to her room that night, he carried the horse with him to his own bed, and he set it on the small chest beside his bedroll, and he did not put it back behind the iron skillet again. The next morning, Whit saw it there and did not speak of it. Beckett saw it there and laid one hand briefly on his older brother's shoulder as he passed, and Hollis nodded once, and that was all. A second hard cold settled on the mountain in mid-February, and the wolves came down. They came in the night, 12 of them drawn by hunger and by the smell of the goats. The first warning was Patience the brown cow lowing in a way Adelaide had never heard her low before. The second was the high panicked bleat of one of the milk goats. The third was the long, low howl that rose from beyond the barn and was answered almost at once by another and another and another until the sound of the pack was all around the dooryard like a moving wall. Beckett was on his feet first. He had the long sharps in his hands before he had crossed the main room. Whit was a half step behind him with the second Winchester. Hollis came last on his bad ankle, but when he came with the heavy shotgun and a face Adelaide had never seen on him, the face of a man who has decided that something will not happen on his ground while he is breathing. "You stay inside," he said to her low. Bar the door behind us. Do not open it for any man until we tell you. I am coming, she said. He stopped. He looked at her in the lantern light. Adelaide, I am coming, Hollis. You took a fall in a ravine, and I went out into the cold with your brothers, and I brought you home. I am not staying behind that bar while there are wolves at our barn. I have an axe. I have a lantern. I will not slow you down. He looked at her for the space of 2 heartbeats. Then he nodded once. Stay close to Whit. Do exactly as Whit tells you. If he tells you to get behind the woodpile, you get behind the woodpile. Do you hear me? Yes. The 4 of them went out into the dooryard together. The pack was around the barn. Adelaide had never seen wolves close before. They were larger than she had thought. They were leaner than she had thought. Their eyes caught the lantern light and threw it back yellow and steady. The leader, a great gray dog with a white blaze at his shoulder, stood at the corner of the barn and did not run. Beckett dropped to one knee in the snow and brought the sharps up. The first shot took the lead wolf clean through the chest and dropped him where he stood. The pack scattered for a heartbeat and then came back the way wolves do when they have decided that hunger is greater than fear. Whit fired twice and dropped 2 more. Hollis fired the shotgun at the second largest of them as it rounded the barn at a run. The shot took the wolf in the shoulder and rolled it sideways into the drift where it lay screaming until Whit put a second round into its head. Adelaide held the lantern high. She did exactly what Whit told her. She moved to the lee of the woodpile when he said to. She moved out again, lantern held above her head when he said to. She lit the way for the brothers as they advanced on the barn. They had killed 5 of the pack and the rest were running when the largest of the remaining wolves, a black and silver beast that had circled wide around the barn, came at Hollis from the side. Hollis did not see him. His back was turned, he was reloading the shotgun, and his bad ankle had betrayed him for a half second on the icy boards, and he was steadying himself against the corner of the barn when the wolf came. Adelaide saw him. She did not think. There was no time to think. She set the lantern down in the snow, and she lifted the small splitting axe she had taken from the woodpile, and she ran. The wolf was on Hollis before she reached him. It hit him at the shoulder and bore him backward into the board's jaws, closing on the heavy buffalo coat at his collar. Hollis got one arm up under its jaw, but the angle was bad and the ankle would not hold him properly, and the wolf was going for his throat with the patience of an animal that has done this before. Adelaide came up behind it. She did not yell. She did not warn it. She brought the axe down once hard on the back of its skull. The wolf dropped. It did not rise. Hollis went down with it. He pushed the dead weight off himself with both hands and rolled onto his side in the snow, his breath coming hard. A long, slow tear opened at his shoulder where the teeth had gone through the coat. There was blood, but not the killing kind. He looked up at her standing over him with the axe still in her hands and her hair coming loose from her cap and her cheeks bright with cold. She would remember the look on his face for the rest of her life. It was not surprise. It was not gratitude. It was not even love exactly, though love was in it. It was the look of a man who has been seen at last for the first time by the only person in the world whose seeing him will matter from this moment forward. Behind them, Beckett's sharps spoke twice more, and the last of the pack broke for the timber and was gone. The dooryard was suddenly very quiet. Whit came around the corner of the barn with his rifle still up. He saw his brother in the snow. He saw Adelaide standing over him with the axe. He saw the dead wolf at her feet. He lowered the rifle slowly. "Brother," he said, and his voice was thick. "Brother, are you hit?" "I am not hit," Hollis said. He was still looking at her. Adelaide let the axe fall. She knelt down in the snow beside him. She put her bare hands against his face. She did not feel the cold. "Hollis Ashford," she said, "do not you ever turn your back on a barn corner again as long as you live." His huge hand came up and closed over hers where it rested against his cheek, and he closed his eyes for a moment, and he laughed a low, broken laugh that was almost a sob, and he said very quietly, "No, ma'am, I will not." That night, while Whit and Beckett dragged the carcasses clear of the dooryard for skinning in the morning, Adelaide sat on the bench by the fire and stitched the torn shoulder of Hollis's buffalo coat back together with the same steady hand her father had taught her. Hollis sat on the floor at her feet, his back against the bench, his bad ankle stretched out the shoulder bandaged in clean linen. He did not speak. He did not need to. After a while, he leaned his head back against her knee, and she rested her free hand in his hair, and they stayed that way until the fire burned down to coals. Beckett came in from the dooryard, stamping snow off his boots, and stopped in the doorway when he saw them. He did not speak. speak. He went to his bunk and let them be. Whit came in last. He looked at his brother and the woman in the firelight, and he set his rifle in the rack, and he smiled a small private smile, and he went to the stove to heat coffee for them all. 2 days later, Whit sat down beside Adelaide on the bench by the fire, and he did not smile. He had his soot-blackened hands folded between his knees, and he looked into the flames the way a man looks into a fire when he has rehearsed the next thing he is going to say more times than he can count. Adelaide knew at once that something had changed. "Ma'am," he said, "I have got to say a thing, and I would rather say it now than wait." She set her mending in her lap. "Yes, Whit." He did not look at her. "I have not been the same since you came up that mountain. You know that. I think the whole cabin knows it. I have been mended in places I did not know were broken. There was a girl down in Helena 3 years ago, ma'am, and she did me a hard turn, and I had told myself I was done with women on that account, and I had told myself a fool thing." He paused. "I am 30 years old, ma'am. I am not as old as Hollis, nor as quiet as Beckett. I work the forge. I can build a cabin. I have a quarter section staked out 2 miles down the south slope that the timber rights are mine on, and I could put up a place there by the end of the summer that would be tight and warm. If you would have me, ma'am, I would marry you on the day the thaw opens that pass. I would be a fair man to you. I would be a faithful man to you. I would never make you cry." He stopped. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she set her hand on top of his where it lay between his knees, and she squeezed it once gently, the way a sister squeezes the hand of a brother she loves. "Whit," she said softly, "you are one of the finest men I have ever known. Any woman in this country would be lucky to be your wife." He nodded once slowly. He did not look up. "But you cannot," he said. "I cannot. Not because of any want of you, Whit. Because of a want of me. My heart has already gone where it has gone. I did not mean for it to. I did not plan it. But it is gone all the same, and it is not coming back, and it would not be fair to you for me to pretend otherwise." Whit nodded again. He let his breath out slowly. "It is Hollis," he said. He said it as a fact, not a question. "It is Hollis." He laughed a little, very softly, almost without sound. Then he turned his hand over under hers and squeezed her fingers once and let her go. "He is a stubborn man, ma'am," he said. "I love him the way a man loves his own bones. But he is the most stubborn fool on this mountain, and there are some good fools on this mountain. You may have to do a deal of the work for him. I hope you have got the patience." "I have got the patience, Whit." He smiled then. It was a small smile and a sad smile, but it was a real one. "Then I hope you will let me stand up beside him on whatever day you make him admit it, ma'am. And I hope you will let me be the uncle to your children when they come. Always, Whit. Always." He stood up. He kissed the top of her head very lightly, the way a brother kisses a sister at the end of a long day, and he went out to the forge to work, and Adelaide sat by the fire with her mending forgotten in her lap and her eyes on the flames for a long time. She did not know that Hollis had heard every word of it. He had come in the back door of the cabin while Whit was speaking, and he had stopped in the breezeway, and he had stood there in the dark with his hand on the doorpost and his head lowered, and he had not moved until Whit went out the front. Then he had gone back out the way he had come, and he had walked down to the cedar at the south corner of the dooryard, and he had stood by the 2 fieldstone markers for a long time in the cold, and he had not come back into the cabin until well after dark. He did not look at her at supper. He did not speak to her at all that evening. When she rose to go to her room, he was sitting in his oak chair by the fire, and his face was turned toward the flames, and the line of his jaw was set in a way she had not seen on him for many weeks. She stopped at the door of her room. She turned. "Hollis." He did not look up. "I am tired," he said. "Good night, Miss Pemberton." She stood looking at him for a long moment. Then she went into her room and closed the door behind her, and she did not bolt it. For the next 4 days, he did not come into the cabin except to sleep and eat. He chopped wood that did not need chopping. He mended harness that did not need mending. He spent 2 whole afternoons up at the small log shrine he and his brothers had built one summer to mark the south boundary of the homestead, and Beckett, who saw him there, did not follow. On the 5th night, Adelaide could bear it no longer. She waited until the cabin was quiet. She put on her shawl. She let herself out the front door into the dooryard. He was there as she had known he would be, standing in the dark at the corner of the dooryard with his hand on the cedar tree. He did not turn when she came up beside him. The night was cold and very still. The stars over the Bitterroot Range were so bright they hurt the eye. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "You have been avoiding me, Hollis." He did not answer. "I think I know why." He turned his head a quarter inch. "You heard Whit," she said. "You heard what he asked, and you heard what I told him." His jaw worked once. He did not speak. "Hollis," she said, "why are you out here in the cold instead of in there by the fire with me?" He let out a long breath. The cloud of it hung in the air between them and faded into the starlight. Because you should marry Whit, ma'am, or somebody like him. Wit is a young man with a young man's heart whole and unbroken. He would build you a cabin, and he would father you healthy children, and he would never wake at night with a name on his lips that was not yours. I cannot give you any of that. I am a man who let a river take his wife and his son, and I have not been able to walk into the town below this mountain in 4.5 years, and I am not whole, Adelaide. I am not whole. You deserve a whole man, not me. She had been waiting for him to say this. She had been waiting since the night she stitched him closed on the long pine table. Hollis Ashford, she said, and her voice was very even. You are the most foolish man on this mountain, and there are some good fools on this mountain. He almost smiled. He could not quite. I'm not foolish, ma'am. You are. You think being whole means never having been hurt. You think being whole means never having loved anybody before. You think I am a young woman with no broken places of my own, and that you would be bringing your sorrow into a clean house. You are wrong on every count. My father and my mother are buried in Boston, and I have stood at their graves with no one beside me. I have been alone in a way that would surprise you, sir. I have been hungry and cold in a city full of bread. I came west on a train because I had nothing left to lose, and I almost died in a snowbank at the foot of this mountain. And then a man I did not know carried me out of that snow, and he set me down by a fire, and in time he opened a door he had nailed shut, and he showed me what was behind it, and I did not flinch. Did I? He did not answer, but he turned slowly, and he looked at her at last. You did not flinch, he said. I am not going to flinch, Hollis, not from your sorrow, not from your river, not from your Lenora and your Elias. They are part of you. I will help you carry them. I am not asking you to set them down. His huge scarred hand came up. He laid it very gently against the side of her face, the way he had laid it once before in the firelight after Mortimer Holloway had ridden away. Adelaide. I am not going home in the spring, Hollis. You may as well get used to it. The only train I am taking is the one that comes at the end of my life, and I intend to take it from this mountain, and I intend to take it from beside you. Now, you can either do your part and ask me properly, or you can keep standing out here in the cold, but I am going back inside before my feet freeze. He did not move for the space of 3 slow heartbeats. Then he bent his head and laid his forehead against hers, and he closed his eyes, and he stood that way for a long minute, breathing her in. Adelaide May Pemberton, he said very low, if you will have me broken places, and all I will be your husband from this day to whatever day the Lord sees fit to take me. I have not got much to offer that a wiser woman would want, but what I have got I will give you, and I will not look back. I will have you Hollis Ashford, broken places and all. He kissed her then in the starlight under the cedar that marked his mother's grave and his father's. It was a brief kiss and a careful one, the kiss of a man who has been told he is allowed and cannot yet quite believe it. When he straightened, his eyes were wet. He laughed once low and almost silent. He pressed his lips to her forehead. Then he took her hand in his enormous calloused one, and he led her back through the dooryard and into the warm cabin, and he closed the door behind them against the cold. By the second week of February, the supplies had begun to pinch. The wolves had killed 2 of the milk goats. The deep cold had opened seams in the spring house that had let frost get at the salt pork. The flour was holding, but only because Adelaide had been making the biscuits smaller, and the coffee was nearly gone, and the lamp oil would not last past the end of March. Hollis's shoulder was healing, but slow, and the ankle still would not bear a long climb. He could not be the one to go down to Bitter Creek for resupply, even if he had been willing to set foot in that town again, which he was not. It was Beckett who sat down at the long pine table on the 3rd Sunday of February and laid the inventory book open in front of all of them. We are short, he said simply. We can stretch what we have got into March, but only if we are careful. The thaw will not open the South Pass before the middle of April. That is 6 weeks. We will not make 6 weeks on what is in the spring house, not with the 4 of us. Whit said, I will go down. Hollis said no. There was a silence. Hollis spoke again more quietly. Not the South Pass. There is no South Pass. The avalanche took it. You would not get through. There is the old trapper's trail off the east shoulder, but that has not been used since our father's time, and it is murder in deep snow, brother. Murder. Beckett laid his hand flat on the table. There is the trapper's trail. The 3 brothers looked at each other. Adelaide, who had been quiet, said what is in the spring house lockbox. They all turned to her. She looked at Hollis. Theodore wrote about it in his letter. $60 in silver. He said it was meant to send me back east. I am not going east. The money is yours. Hollis shook his head slowly. That money is yours, Adelaide. He set it aside for you. He set it aside to send me away. I am not being sent away. Use it, Hollis. Buy what we need for the cabin. There are 4 of us now. Use it for us. There was a silence around the table that had a different quality than any silence she had heard in the cabin before. It was the silence of a household, not of three brothers and a guest. It was the silence of people deciding together. Beckett said quietly, $60 will not cover what we need. Not all of it, not the lamp oil and the coffee and the flour and the powder and shot to last us through to April. We are short by a good $20 at town prices, and town prices are about to rise on account of the closed roads. Adelaide reached up to her throat. She unpinned her mother's cameo brooch. She laid it on the table beside the inventory book. The three brothers stared at it. Hollis said no. It was carved in Italy, she said evenly. My mother was given it by my father on their wedding day in 1849. It is the only thing I have of her. It is also worth in any town with a respectable jeweler somewhere between $30 and $40 in silver, Adelaide. Hollis. I have a husband now, or I'm about to have one, and a husband is more than a brooch. My mother would have understood. She would have told me to do it. She did tell me to do it. In fact, when I was 8 years old, she said, Della, you keep this thing for as long as you have nothing else. And the day you have something else, you let it go, and you do not look back. She closed Hollis's huge hand around the small carved brooch. Beckett went down with the silver and the cameo. He went on the morning of the last Tuesday in February. He took Hank, the larger of the two Belgians, with snowshoes strapped over the saddle for the bad places. He took an empty pack frame and a list in Adelaide's careful slanting hand. He took Whit's good Winchester and a sheath knife and 3 days of food. He kissed Adelaide once on the forehead, the way Whit had kissed her, the way a brother kisses a sister, and he gripped Hollis's hand once at the dooryard, and he rode out into the snow before the sun had cleared the south ridge. He told them he would be back in 5 days. On the 5th day, a storm came down off the divide. It came hard and fast, a true high country blizzard, the kind that buries trail and signal and trail markers alike. And by the second hour of it, Hollis was at the dooryard with the lantern in his hand and the wind tearing at his coat, and he was not speaking. By the end of the day, the snow was so deep at the cabin that Whit had to dig a path to the barn to feed the stock. By the end of the second day, there was no trail anywhere. By the end of the third day, Beckett had not come. Adelaide did not sleep on the third night. She sat at the long pine table with the inventory book open in front of her and the small iron chickadee key resting in her palm, and she did not weep. She knew that Hollis was watching her. She knew that Whit was watching her. She knew that what they did in the cabin in these next hours would matter for the rest of their lives. On the morning of the 4th day after the storm, Hollis came to her with his coat already on. I am going after him. Hollis, your ankle will hold for what I need it to hold for. Whit is staying with you. I will not be more than 2 days. If I am not back by the evening of the second day, you and Whit close the cabin and you wait for the thaw, and you do not come after me. Do you hear me, Adelaide? I hear you. He looked at her for a long moment, then he laid his hand against her cheek the way he had laid it twice before, and he said very softly, you remember what you told me in the fever about the third hand? I remember it works the other way too. You have got a third hand now. It is mine. You can lean on it. Do you hear me? I hear you, Hollis. He went out into the cold. He found Beckett on the second day sheltering in a half-collapsed trapper's lean-to 4 miles east of the cabin. Beckett had taken a fall on the icy switchback above the lower meadow. The Belgian had broken a foreleg and he had had to put him down. The pack of supplies had spilled and he had spent most of a day in waist-deep snow gathering up what he could carry on his own back. He had broken his right leg above the knee in the same fall, and he had splinted it himself with the broken stock of the Winchester and his belt, and he had walked and crawled and dragged himself to the lean-to before the storm closed in. He had been there for 3 days. He had a small fire. He had no food left. He had been singing the same hymns his older brother had sung in the ravine, because that was how the Ashford men kept themselves alive in the dark hours when nothing else would do. He laughed when Hollis came through the door of the lean-to. He laughed just like Hollis had laughed in the ravine. Brother Beckett said, his voice cracked from cold. I had a feeling you were going to be a fool about this. I am a fool about this, Hollis said. He knelt down beside his brother. Now, let us see about getting you home. It took them a day and a half to make the cabin. Hollis carried the pack on his own back. He pulled the makeshift sledge that Beckett had been planning to drag himself home on, with Beckett tied onto it and bundled in every blanket the lean-to had held. Hollis's bad ankle gave on the last switchback, and he went down hard onto his knees, and he got back up, and he kept walking, and he came into the dooryard at dusk on the 7th day of Beckett's absence, dragging his brother behind him on a rope over his shoulder, and Adelaide saw him coming and ran out into the snow without her coat to meet him. In the pack on Hollis's back were the flour and the coffee and the lamp oil and the powder and shot. Tucked at the very top, wrapped in a square of clean cloth, was Adelaide's mother's cameo brooch. Beckett had not been able to bring himself to sell it. He had used the silver alone, and he had bargained hard, and he had brought back almost everything on the list, and he had brought the brooch home. Adelaide stood in the dooryard with the brooch in her hands and tears running down her face. For the first time since the day she had read the letters in the cherry box, Hollis looked down at her. He was so tired he was swaying. "I will buy it back from you proper one day," he said. "With money I have earned, I will pin it to your shawl in front of God and our children. Until then, you keep it. You hear me. I hear you, Hollis." Beckett lay on the sledge in the snow and laughed weakly and said, "Lord above, brother, take her inside before she freezes." Hollis took her inside. The thaw came at the very end of March that year, ahead of schedule after a string of bright, unseasonable days. The South Pass was reopened by the second week of April, and on the third Saturday of April, a sleigh came up the trail to the Ashford cabin with 3 men in it. The first was Mortimer Holloway. He wore his beaver pelt coat and his yellow leather gloves. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm. The second was Sheriff Augustus Calloway, an old man of perhaps 60, with long white side whiskers and a tired, honest face. The third was a deputy whose name Adelaide never learned. Holloway stepped down from the sleigh first. He was smiling. "Miss Pemberton," he called out to her across the dooryard. "The thaw, you see, as I promised." The 4 of them came out of the cabin together. Hollis stood in the middle of the porch with his shotgun held loose at his side. Beckett, on a crutch, now his right leg still splinted, stood at his left. Witt stood at his right with the Winchester. Adelaide stood between Hollis and Beckett, her back straight, her chin lifted, the small iron chickadee key resting at her throat beside her mother's cameo. Sheriff Calloway took off his hat. "Mr. Ashford, Mr. Holloway has come up here on a matter of paper. He claims a writ on the lady. Now, I read the writ on the way up. I do not like it. It is the most peculiar writ I have ever held in my hand, but it bears the seal of Judge Whitfield over in Bitter Creek, and I am bound by my office to hear it spoken." "Speak it, Sheriff," said Hollis. Calloway turned to Holloway. "Read it." Holloway opened his portfolio. He read aloud, "The Montana Territorial Act of 1875 concerning betrothed women and inherited obligations. The deceased Theodore Ashford, owing a sum of $300 to the Bitter Creek Bank, was at the time of his death betrothed to one Adelaide May Pemberton of Boston, Massachusetts, whose passage west was paid in part out of funds advanced by the said bank against the said debt. By terms of the act, the betrothed assumes upon the death of her intended such portion of the said debt as cannot be discharged by the deceased estate, and is bound to remain within the territory until said debt is satisfied by labor or by such other means as the holder of the debt may direct." He looked up. "Miss Pemberton must come down to Bitter Creek Sheriff to work off the debt. There are several positions available at my house. Her labor is valued at $15 a month. She will be free of the debt in 20 months. Calloway said evenly, unless, of course, she has a husband. Holloway's smile faltered. "I beg your pardon." "The act," said Calloway, "reads in the next paragraph that no betrothed woman may be held to a deceased man's debt if she is at the time the writ is served lawfully married to another. A husband's standing supersedes a betrothed's. That is in the same law you just quoted, Mr. Holloway. It is in the next clause. I checked." Holloway said nothing. Calloway turned to Adelaide. "Miss Pemberton, are you on this day lawfully married?" Adelaide looked at Hollis. Hollis looked at her. She turned back to Calloway. Her voice was perfectly steady. "Sheriff, I am betrothed to Hollis Ashford. We have given each other our word. We have not yet stood before a clergyman because the pass has been closed and the nearest preacher is in Helena." Calloway nodded once. He smiled very slightly. "Well, now, ma'am. As it happens, before the war, I was a circuit minister out of Cheyenne. I was ordained in 1861, and I have not surrendered my papers. I cannot perform a marriage in any town of the territory without registering it with the county clerk, but I can witness vows here on this porch, and I can sign the lines of a frontier bands, and I can leave it with you to register at the courthouse the next time one of you gentlemen is down in Bitter Creek. Will that suit?" "It will suit," said Hollis Ashford. And so they were married in the dooryard of the Ashford cabin on the third Saturday of April in the year of our Lord, 1879, with Sheriff Augustus Calloway saying the words, and Beckett standing on his crutch as witness for his brother, and Witt standing as witness for Adelaide and Mortimer Holloway, watching from beside his sleigh with a face the color of bad milk. The vows were short. Hollis's voice cracked once on the word cherish. Adelaide's voice did not crack at all. Calloway signed the paper. Beckett signed it after him. Witt signed his name in his careful, new, uneven hand, slowly, the first time in his life he had ever signed it on anything that mattered. When it was done, Calloway folded the paper and handed it to Hollis. He turned to Holloway. Mortimer, I would suggest you climb back into that sleigh and ride yourself down off this mountain and not come back. There is a matter of how Judge Whitfield came to put his seal on a writ this peculiar, and I have got a deputy in Bitter Creek who has been talking to a clerk in your bank for the better part of a month, and there is a federal investigator coming up from Cheyenne next week. You will want to be in your house, sir, when he calls. Do you understand me? Holloway did not answer. He climbed into the sleigh. He did not look back at Adelaide. The deputy and the sheriff climbed in after him, and the sleigh slid back down the south trail in the bright spring sunlight, and within 10 minutes it was gone. Mortimer Holloway was arrested in his own parlor in Bitter Creek 9 days later on charges of bribery, fraud, and misuse of position. Judge Whitfield was suspended from the bench pending federal review and resigned his commission 3 months after that. The Bitter Creek Bank passed into a receivership and was reorganized under new management within the year. None of the Ashfords ever saw Mortimer Holloway again. He died of a stroke in a federal prison hospital in Wyoming in the autumn of 1883, alone at the age of 57. Hollis carried Adelaide across the threshold of the cabin that evening. He shut the door against the spring wind, and the last of the day's light faded outside, and the fire burned down to a steady, warm glow. And what passed between them that night was theirs alone, the way it should be. By morning, she was his wife in every sense. By morning, the long winter was over. The first spring on the mountain came in a great rush, the way it does in the high country all at once, and with extravagance. The drifts shrank, the creek ran high and brown, the cottonwoods budded, wildflowers came up in the south meadow, balsam root and lupine and Indian paintbrush, and the air smelled of new pine and wet earth. The Ashford brothers expanded the cabin that summer. Hollis and Beckett raised a long bedroom along the south wall for him and Adelaide, and a wide covered porch overlooking the valley where she could sit in the evenings, and Whit forged the new hinges and the door pulls and a brass plate for the wedding lintel that read simply Ashford. Above that lintel on the inside of the door frame, Hollis carved with his own knife the letters H and A and the year 1879, and below them, very small, the letters L and E for Lenora and Elias, because he had told Adelaide on a quiet evening in May that he wanted them in this house too. That the new beam over their bed should know all the names that the old roof had known, and Adelaide had wept and held him and said yes, all of them, every one. In the second week of June, Whit went down to Bitter Creek for the first town social since Cordelia Vance had ridden out 3 years before. He came back the following Sunday with a long, slow grin on his face and the look of a man who had noticed something. Her name was Rosalind Brooks. She was the daughter of the Bitter Creek blacksmith. She had red hair the color of new copper and a temper to match it, and she could shoe a horse better than half the men in the territory, and she did not flinch when a tall mountain man with soot on his hands asked her to dance. Whit started going down the second Saturday of every month after that. He married Rosie at the new chapel in Bitter Creek in October of 1879, and Hollis stood up beside him as best man, and Beckett played the parting glass on the harmonica when the ceremony was done, and Adelaide cried into a clean white handkerchief and held Rosie's hand all the way back up to the cabin in the wagon. Beckett did not marry. He had said quietly one evening in the second summer that the mountain was his bride enough, and that he had not been built for the life that Hollis and Whit were building. He took over the inventory book again with Adelaide's blessing. He kept Cornelius's harmonica oiled. He read every book that came up the mountain with the new male rider, and he wrote in his small leather notebook every night by candlelight, slow, steady, cursive that grew finer year by year. He was the favorite uncle of all the children that came after, and there were many. Elias Theodore Ashford was born in the new bedroom on the south wall in February of 1880, 10 months and a day after his parents had spoken vows in the dooryard. He had Adelaide's honey blonde hair and Hollis's amber eyes. Hollis sat by the bed in the morning of his son's first day on this earth, with the small wooden horse from the mantelpiece in his palm. He did not cry. He did not laugh. He simply held the horse, and he held the boy's small fist around his own thumb, and he sat that way for a long, quiet hour. He carved a second wooden horse that summer for Elias Theodore. He kept the first one on the mantle. They stood there together, the old one and the new one, for the rest of his life. Lenora Adelaide Ashford was born in 1882 on a bright August afternoon with her mother's pale blue eyes and her father's dark hair. They named her for both grandmothers and for the wife and son who had gone before. Adelaide had spoken to Hollis about it slowly and softly in the second month of her pregnancy. And Hollis had bowed his head and held her hand and said only that there was room enough in his heart now for all of them, and that he wanted no shadows in this house, and that if a daughter came, he wanted her to know whose name she carried. Lenora Adelaide had her grandmother's gift for languages and her Aunt Rosie's red-hot temper, and she would grow up to marry a schoolmaster in Helena and run the territory's first lending library for women in 1905. Becket James Ashford was born in 1885, the easiest of the births, on a quiet October morning. He was named for his uncle Becket, who had been the first one to speak when Adelaide had laid the small bundle in his lap and who had said only his throat thick that if it was all the same to her, this one would be the lawyer of the family. Becket James was a serious boy with his father's broad shoulders and his Uncle Becket's gift for watching. He would go to the new University of Montana at Missoula in 1902, the first Ashford ever to attend a college, and he would graduate with honors in law in 1906. The cabin grew, so did the homestead. Whit and Rosie built their own place a half-mile down the south slope and filled it with 6 children of their own, 4 boys and 2 girls who came up the path to the Ashford cabin every Sunday for dinner like a small, noisy migration. Hollis bought back his wife's mother's cameo brooch from Hargrove's General Store in Bitter Creek in the autumn of 1880 with the first proper money he had earned from a timber contract, and he pinned it to her shawl on the front porch of the cabin while their son slept in her arms, and she had worn it every Sunday from that day until her last. Hollis Ashford walked back into Bitter Creek for the first proper visit in the spring of 1880. He had been up to the Yellowstone first. He had taken Adelaide with him and Becket in the small bundle that was their first son, and he had stood at the bend of the river where the boat had broken up 6 years before. He had not spoken for a long time. Then he had lowered his head, and he had spoken aloud just once to his first wife and his first son, and he had told them what he had brought to show them, and he had asked them in the simple country way of a man who has loved more than once to bless what came after. The river had run on, the wind had moved through the cottonwoods, and Hollis Ashford had nodded as if to an answer he could just hear, and he had taken his second wife's hand, and they had ridden back up to the cabin, and he had walked into Bitter Creek the very next week and bought a new plow for the south garden and shaken hands with 3 men who had not seen him in town in 6 years and counting. The years moved. In 1903, 25 years after the night, 3 brothers had carried a half-frozen woman in a navy blue traveling dress out of a snowdrift on the south slope. Hollis Ashford was 61 years old. His hair was white as the cedar bark in winter. His shoulders were still wide, but a little stooped. His ankle still gave him trouble in cold weather. He read the Bible on the porch every Sunday morning to whichever grandchildren were near at hand. Adelaide was 48, with the first faint silver in her honey blonde hair, with lines at the corners of her eyes from 25 years of frontier sun, and she was by every measure that mattered the woman of that mountain. Their 3 children were grown. Elias Theodore was 23 and ran the western half of the Ashford Ranch with his quiet new wife Eliza, who had come from a homestead near Three Forks. Lenora Adelaide had married her schoolmaster the previous October, Becket James. 18 and just home from his first year at Missoula, was reading every law book in his uncle's collection and arguing about the railroads at supper. Whit was 55 gray at the temples, still smiling, still working the forge. Rosie's red hair had gone to copper and silver mixed. Their 6 children ranged in age from 22 to 8. There were 3 grandchildren in the Whit Ashford line already, with a 4th on the way. And Whit had been heard to say more than once that he had tried to do everything in his life, big and slow, and had managed only to be slow. Becket, 58, had moved out of the lean to off the kitchen the year their first grandchild had been born, and built himself a small, clean writer's cabin 100 yards up the ridge where he kept his books and his harmonica and his neat slanting cursive. He had finished the summer before a book-length manuscript called The Winter of the Bride, which was a slow, careful telling of all that had happened in the Ashford cabin between the December of 1878 and the April of 1879, and which would be published in Boston in 1906, and would in the next decade make its slow, patient way into the libraries of every Western town between the Missouri and the Pacific. The cedar at the south corner of the dooryard had grown taller. Beneath it, beside the 2 old fieldstone markers, a 3rd marker had been laid 5 years before for Cornelius and Mary's grandson, Eli Ashford Whit, and Rosie's youngest at the time, who had been taken at 3 by a fever no one had been able to break. The marker was small and well tended. Lenore and Elias's markers had been rejoined by it, and Hollis went out to the cedar most Sundays in summer and stood there for a long while in the morning. And he had stopped many years before expecting any answer, and he had not stopped going. It was on a clear afternoon in late June of 1903 that the narrator's voice came down for the last time, slow and warm, the way it does when a long evening has reached its proper ending. Hollis and Adelaide sat on the wide covered porch of the Ashford cabin. The chair Hollis sat in had been built by their son, Elias Theodore, the previous Christmas, broad enough to hold his father's frame in comfort and high enough to ease his stiff back. Adelaide sat beside him in a smaller chair, her shawl across her knees, her mother's cameo brooch pinned at her throat, the way it had been every Sunday for 24 years. Two of their grandchildren, Elias Theodore's small son Hollis Jr., age 4, and Lenora Adelaide's small daughter Mary, age 3, were chasing each other through the long grass of the South Meadow with high, happy shrieks. Inside the cabin, Beckett was at the long pine table writing. On the mantel above the great stone hearth, 3 small carved things stood in a row in the afternoon light. The original wooden horse with its mane streaming in a wind that no longer blew. The second wooden horse, the one Hollis had carved in 1880 for Elias Theodore. And between them the small iron chickadee that Whit had forged the night of the Cherrywood letters, set down beside the 2 horses by Adelaide herself on the morning of her wedding, and never moved since. Beside the chickadee lay the cameo brooch in its small velvet case, taken out only on Sundays, old life and new life side by side. Adelaide laid her hand on Hollis's hand on the arm of the chair. "You remember," she said quietly, "the day I came up this mountain?" He smiled. The white whiskers at his jaw caught the light. "You were lying in a snowbank, ma'am. I thought you were dead. I was nearly dead. The letter had lied. It had promised me a husband. It had promised me a home. It lied, Hollis. It lied," he agreed. She squeezed his hand. "But the lie carried me here," she said. "The lie carried me to a mountain I did not know, and a cabin built in 1841 by a man named Cornelius, and 3 brothers who pulled me out of a drift, and a fire I did not freeze beside, and a man who would not look at me for a month because he had been afraid to look at any woman for 4.5 years. The lie carried me to you, Hollis Ashford, so I cannot in the end hate it." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said very low, $3.70. "What?" He laughed softly. "You had $3.70 in your purse, Adelaide. I asked Whit that first morning what you had in your bag. He had checked while you slept in case there was anything that needed sending back east to family. He told me $3.70. I have thought about that figure most every day for 25 years. Why? Because it was nothing, and it was everything. It was what you had to your name, and it was less than the price of a sack of flour. And you walked off that platform with $3.70 and a dead man's letter, and you walked into a storm rather than ride in a bad man's carriage. And that man was the whole shape of you in $3.70. She laughed quietly. Her eyes were wet. "Old fool," she said. "Old fool," he agreed. Out in the meadow, little Hollis Jr. caught his cousin Mary by the hem of her dress, and she shrieked and laughed and went down in the long grass, and the 2 of them rolled together among the wild flowers like puppies in clover. Inside the cabin, Beckett's pen scratched on. Whit's harmonica, distant, drifted up from the lower place where Whit was sitting on his own porch with Rosie and a coffee playing the parting glass for the simple pleasure of the tune. The narrator's voice came down soft and slow. The letter had promised her a husband, the letter had promised her a home, the letter had lied, and the lie had carried her all the way from a Boston row house with copper pots hanging from a hook across a continent on iron rails off a wooden platform with $3.70 in her purse into a storm that had nearly killed her out of a snowdrift in the arms of a man whose name she had not yet known, into a cabin where 3 brothers had been waiting all their lives without knowing for whom, and through one long winter, and through a summer, and through 25 years of seasons stacked on seasons, until the day she sat on the porch of a house her husband had built with his own hands and watched the next generation of her family chase each other through wildflowers in the South Meadow, and thought, as she had thought 1,000 times before, that the day she stepped off that train at Bitter Creek Station was the day her life began. The letter had lied, but the mountain had told the truth. Winter always ends. Friend, the fire is low, and the night is far gone. The story is done. Stay a moment longer if you like. The coffee pot is still on the stove. Hollis Ashford is on the porch with his wife of 25 years. Beckett is writing in the cabin. Whit is playing his father's harmonica down the slope at his own place. 3 little carvings stand on the mantelpiece above the great stone hearth. 2 horses and a chickadee, old life and new, none of them displaced. All of them held. Down the slope and 40 miles south, the town of Bitter Creek goes quiet for the night. The chapel is open again. There is a school. The bank has a new president. The platform where a young woman once stood with $3.70 in her purse is just a wooden platform, now weathered gray, used every day by every kind of traveler who comes west looking for a home. Some of them find one, some of them do not. But every now and then on this mountain and on others, a letter lies and a storm rises, and a stranger is carried out of the snow by hands she did not know were waiting, and a fire is built up high against the dark, and the long, slow work of becoming a family begins. That is the way of it. That is the truth the mountain has been telling the whole time. Good night, friends. Sleep warm. Winter always ends.